There are few moments in the annals of the 31st millennium when the master of mankind paused before claiming what was rightfully his. Yet on the barren slopes of Mount Fadan Moor, beneath the twin suns of Nuceria, the emperor of mankind hesitated. Below him stretched a scene that would echo through eternity, not for its scale, but for what it revealed about the nature of compassion and the weight of fatherhood. The mountain was stained red with blood that was not spilled in vain. 5 armies of the Nucerian high riders surrounded the rebels, their banners gleaming in the harsh light. Servo skulls circled overhead like carrion birds, broadcasting the final moments of the slave uprising to the palatial estates below. Not the aristocrats of Deshere and their allied city-states had come to witness the end of the gladiator who had dared to dream of freedom. Angron stood at the peak, his massive frame silhouetted against the burning sky. Even from orbit, the Emperor had felt the psychic emanations of his lost son, a beacon of pain and fury that cut through the warp like a blade. The Primarch's armor was cracked and blooded, his chain axes hanging loose in hands that trembled not with fear, but with the constant agony of the devices lodged in his skull. Around him, barely 300 gladiators remained from the thousands who had followed him in rebellion. They stood in formation, battered shields raised against the inevitable, their eyes fixed on their lord with the devotion of those who had chosen death over slavery. The Emperor descended through the atmosphere in silence, his golden barge cutting through the clouds like a falling star. He had observed Angron for months, watching from the void as his son led charge after charge against the forces of oppression. Pride had warmed the master of mankind's ancient heart as he witnessed the tactical genius and unbreakable spirit that marked Angron as a true son of the line. Yet now, as he gazed upon the scene below, something else stirred in the depths of his consciousness. The psychic probe was gentle, a whisper of thought that touched Angron's mind without the Primarch's knowledge. What the Emperor found there made him pause in ways that 10,000 years of war had not. The butcher's nails were not simple neural implants, but archaeotech of the darkest kind, ancient technology from the Dark Age, or corrupted and repurposed by minds that understood nothing of what they wielded. The devices were eating into Angron's brain tissue like acid, each surge of induced rage burning away another fragment of his soul. But beneath the agony, beneath the layers of artificial fury and chemical madness, the Emperor sensed something that stopped his breath. Angron had been an empath. The echoes were faint, damaged beyond easy repair, but unmistakable. His lost son had once possessed the ability to absorb the pain of others, to offer comfort through shared suffering. The nails had not simply made him a killer. They had turned his greatest gift into his most terrible curse. The Emperor's mind raced across the decades, pulling memories from the depths of his perfect recall. 3 months prior, the Mechanicum expedition to Lucius had discovered something extraordinary in the depths of a forgotten STC vault. Neural restoration matrices, technology so advanced that even the Fabricator General had approached it with reverence. The templates had been sealed away, deemed too dangerous for general use, too precious to risk in any but the most desperate circumstances. This was such a circumstance. The decision crystallized in an instant that would reshape the fate of galaxies. The Emperor would not simply claim his son and watch him die by degrees as the nails consumed what remained of his mind. He would heal him, restore what the butchers of Nuceria had stolen, and in doing so, perhaps reclaim something of the dream that had driven him to create the Primarchs in the first place. Yet the healing could not be performed here. 'Tis not with Angron lost in rage and surrounded by enemies. The Vox transmission crackled across the Golden Barge's command deck. Custodian General Valdor received his orders without question, though the Emperor caught the flicker of surprise that crossed his ancient warrior's features. The mission had changed. They would not simply extract the Primarch and leave his followers to die. They would save them all. "My Emperor," Valdor said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The tactical situation is complex. 5 enemy armies, elevated positions, overlapping fields of fire. The gladiators are exhausted and outnumbered 50-1. The Emperor's golden eyes blazed with an inner light that had not dimmed since the birth of stars. They are not gladiators, Constantin. They are his family. And we do not abandon family to appease the sensibilities of slavers. The custodians deployed with the precision of a clockwork mechanism given life. Drop pods thundered down from orbit, each one containing a warrior worth 100 lesser men. The auramite-clad guardians of the throne hit the mountainside like golden lightning, their guardian spears carving through the Nucerian ranks with contemptuous ease. The High Riders had brought armies to slaughter rebels. They had not prepared to face the personal guard of the master of mankind. Angron roared his defiance as the golden warriors appeared among his enemies, his chain axes screaming to life as he prepared for one final charge. The nails bit deep into his cortex, flooding his system with artificial rage that made tactical thought nearly impossible. Yet some part of him, and some fragment of the man he had once been, recognized that salvation had come not in death, but in the form of warriors whose loyalty burned brighter than stars. The Emperor materialized on the mountaintop as the last of the Nucerian commanders fell. His presence was like the weight of eternity made manifest, a golden figure of such authority that even the pain-maddened Primarch fell silent. Angron's gladiator siblings gathered behind their lord, bloodied weapons in hand, their eyes fixed on the being whose legend had reached even the fighting pits of Nuceria. "My son," the Emperor said, and his voice carried across the mountain like the first word of creation. "You have fought well. Your rebellion ends not in death, but in rebirth. Come with me, and I will show you what you truly are." Angron's response was a wordless snarl, his massive hands tightening on his weapons. The nails allowed no response but rage, no emotion but fury. Yet the Emperor saw deeper, felt the fragments of the empathic soul that still struggled beneath the artificial storm. He saw the gladiator who had absorbed the pain of his fellow slaves, the leader who had chosen to suffer with his followers rather than escape alone, the son who had been broken not by cruelty, but by the systematic destruction of his capacity for compassion. "Your family will come as well," the Emperor continued, gesturing toward the surviving gladiators. "None will be left behind. None will die for the sins of those who enslaved you." For the first time since the nails had been hammered into his skull, Angron hesitated. The rage faltered, just for an instant, or as something deeper stirred in the depths of his tormented mind. The Emperor stepped closer, his presence washing over the mountain like golden sunlight, and for that moment the pain receded enough for Angron to think clearly. The word that escaped the Primarch's lips was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of anguish and hope. "Father?" The Emperor smiled, and for the first time in millennia, it was not the calculated expression of a conqueror or the distant benevolence of a god. It was the smile of a parent who had found his lost child, and who would move heaven and earth to see him whole again. "Yes, my son, I am here, and I will make you whole." The golden halls of the Emperor's flagship echoed with sounds they had never heard before. Not the measured tread of custodians or the whispered prayers of Mechanicum adepts, but the rough voices of gladiators and the scrape of worn boots against pristine deck plates. The survivors of Mount Fedan Moor moved through the corridors like ghosts given flesh, their eyes wide with wonder and suspicion as they gazed upon wonders beyond their comprehension. Angron stood at the center of the observation deck, his massive frame rigid with barely contained fury. The translation to orbit had taken mere minutes, but each second had been an eternity of agony as the butcher's nails bit deeper into his skull. The rescue he had never asked for felt like the cruelest joke the universe had ever played. He had been prepared to die with his brothers and sisters, to find peace at last in the red sand of Nuceria. Instead, He found himself trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by reminders of his failure to save those who had followed him. The Emperor approached across the gleaming deck, his presence like the warmth of a distant sun. Behind him came a procession that defied every precedent of imperial protocol. Scarred gladiators walked beside golden custodians, their crude weapons and patched armor a stark contrast to the perfection that surrounded them. Corna, her left arm bound in makeshift bandages, leaned heavily on her spear as she limped forward. Galthan bore the marks of a dozen wounds across his broad chest, each one a testament to the battles they had fought together. Melek, barely more than a boy, clutched a gladius that was longer than his arm, his eyes never leaving Angron's back. "You should have left us to die," Angron snarled, his words torn from a throat raw with rage and grief. The nails sent spikes of agony through his brain, each syllable a knife that carved deeper into his consciousness. "We chose our fate. We chose our end. You had no right to steal that from us." The Emperor regarded his son with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. There was no judgment in that ancient gaze, no disappointment at the ingratitude, only a sorrow so profound that it seemed to weigh down the very air around them. "You chose to die for each other," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "I have simply given you the chance to live for each other instead." Angron's response was a wordless roar that shook the reinforced windows. His chain axes materialized in his hands as if summoned by pure fury, of their teeth screaming to life as he advanced on the golden figure before him. The custodians moved to intercede, their guardian spears lowering with mechanical precision, but the Emperor raised a single hand to halt them. This confrontation had been inevitable from the moment of rescue, and it would serve no purpose to postpone it. The Primarch's attack was a thing of terrible beauty, each strike guided by decades of gladiatorial training and enhanced by the superhuman reflexes of his engineered physiology. Yet for all his speed and strength, the weapons found only empty air. The Emperor did not block or parry. He simply was not where the blades fell, moving with a grace that made even the fastest warrior seem clumsy by comparison. "Your anger is not truly your own," the Emperor said, as Angron's assault continued, at each missed strike, fueling the Primarch's rage to greater heights. "The devices in your skull feed upon it, amplify it, twist it into something that serves their purpose rather than yours. You are not fighting me, my son. You are fighting the chains they placed upon your mind." The words penetrated the haze of artificial fury, like arrows finding their mark. Angron stumbled, his weapons faltering, as a moment of clarity broke through the chemical storm in his brain. For an instant, he saw himself as the Emperor must see him. Not the Lord of the Red Sands, not the undefeated gladiator who had led his people to freedom, but a broken thing driven by impulses he could no longer control. The moment passed, and the nails bit deep once more. Yet something had changed. The rage was still there, but beneath it stirred something else. Not hope, for the devices had burned that emotion from him long ago, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. "Show me," Angron whispered, his weapons falling silent as his hands began to shake. "Show me what you claim you can do." The Emperor nodded, and together they walked deeper into the ship's heart. The gladiators followed, their footsteps echoing in the vast corridors like the drums of a funeral march. They passed through chambers filled with wonders that defied understanding, past archives that contained the collected wisdom of 1,000,000 worlds, through laboratories where the fundamental forces of reality were bent to the Emperor's will. The healing chamber lay at the ship's core, protected by layers of security that could withstand the fury of a dying star. It was a thing of impossible beauty, was crafted from materials that seemed to drink in the light around them and reflect it back as something purer. Neural interface cables hung from the ceiling like golden serpents, their surfaces inscribed with patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the chamber's heart lay a throne-like structure, its form somehow both ancient and impossibly advanced. "This is archaeotech from the dark age of technology," the Emperor explained, his voice hushed with something approaching reverence. "Neural restoration matrices, capable of repairing damage that was thought to be irreversible. The Mechanicum discovered them in the depths of an STC vault, but they feared to use such knowledge. They understood its power, but not its purpose." Angron circled the chamber like a caged beast, his eyes taking in every detail with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive through 1,000 arena battles. The technology was beyond his comprehension, but he could sense the potential that thrummed through every component. This was not some crude tool of butchery like the nails, but something designed to heal rather than harm. "The process is not without risk," the Emperor continued, his gaze fixed on his son's scarred features. "The neural pathways damaged by your implants must be rebuilt from the ground up. Your consciousness will be suspended while new connections are forged, old wounds cauterized, dead tissue restored to life. You will experience memories you have forgotten, feel emotions that have been denied to you for decades. It will be agony beyond description." A harsh laugh escaped Angron's throat, though there was no humor in the sound. "I have lived with agony for so long that it has become my closest companion. The question is not whether I can endure pain, but whether I can endure hope." It was then that Corna stepped forward, her weathered face set with the determination that had carried her through 1,000 battles. "Lord," she said, the title spoken not with the forced reverence of a slave, but with the genuine respect of one warrior for another. "If there is a chance, any chance at all, that you can be whole again, then you must take it. Not for yourself, but for all of us who have followed you this far." The other gladiators murmured their agreement, their voices joining in a chorus of support that seemed to surprise even them. They had followed Angron into rebellion, not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in him. Now they asked him to believe in something more than death, more than the endless cycle of violence that had defined their existence. Angron turned to face them, these broken souls who had somehow found strength enough to hope when he could not. In their eyes, he saw reflections of his own pain, but also something else, something the nails had not been able to completely destroy. He reached out with senses dulled by decades of artificial rage, trying to touch the emotions he had once been able to feel as clearly as physical objects. There was pain, yes, exhaustion and grief, and the bone-deep weariness of those who had fought too long with too little hope. But beneath it all, like a flame that refused to be extinguished, burned their faith in him. Not in what he was, but in what he might become. For the first time since the nails had been driven into his skull, Angron felt something other than rage or pain. It was faint, almost too weak to register, but unmistakable. The ghost of empathy, the shadow of the gift he had once possessed. His gladiator siblings' emotions touched his mind like whispers from a half-remembered dream, and for one precious moment, he was not alone in his agony. The Emperor watched this exchange in silence, his ancient features touched with something that might have been approval. When Angron finally turned back to him, there was a new quality in the Primarch's voice. Not hope, for that would have been too much to ask, but perhaps its precursor, the willingness to try. "If I do this," Angron said, his words measured and careful, "and if by some miracle you succeed in your restoration, what then? What becomes of a monster who learns too late that he was meant to be a healer?" The Emperor's smile was sad but genuine, the expression of a father who had waited too long to embrace a lost child. "Then you begin the hardest battle of all, my son, the battle to forgive yourself and find a way to live with what you have become, but you will not fight it alone." Angron looked once more at his gladiator family, at the golden figure who claimed to be his father, at the impossible chamber that promised either salvation or a kinder form of damnation. The choice before him was simple in its complexity: continue to exist as a slave to artificial rage, or risk everything on the possibility of becoming something more. He stepped toward the healing throne, each footfall echoing like the beat of a heart that had forgotten how to hope. Then let us begin. The activation of the healing chamber began with silence, so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. Ancient circuits hummed to life for the first time in millennia, their awakening marked not by the crude thunder of primitive machinery, but by a resonance that touched the very bones of those who witnessed it. The neural restoration matrix unfolded like a flower of gold and silver, each component moving with the precision of celestial mechanics as systems older than the imperium stirred from their endless sleep. Angron stood before the throne-like apparatus, his massive frame dwarfed by the chamber's impossible architecture. The butcher's nails sent constant spikes of agony through his skull, each pulse a reminder of the chains he had worn for so long that freedom seemed like a dream from another man's life. Or yet beneath the artificial rage, something stirred. Not hope, for that emotion had been burned from him long ago, but perhaps its distant cousin, the willingness to believe that pain might one day end. The Emperor's voice cut through the chamber's humming like a blade of pure authority. The process cannot be undertaken alone. The neural pathways we seek to restore were designed for connection, for the sharing of burden and sensation. Without anchors to guide you back from the depths of memory and pain, you may lose yourself entirely in the restoration. Corna stepped forward without hesitation, her scarred features set with the determination that had carried her through 100 arena battles. Where he goes, we follow, as we have always done. Behind her, the other gladiator survivors formed a loose circle around their lord, their weathered faces reflecting a loyalty that death itself had failed to break. They had followed Angron into rebellion, stood with him on the slopes of Mount Fedan Moor, and now they would walk with him into whatever hell the healing demanded. The Emperor's ancient eyes assessed each of them in turn, weighing their resolve against the ordeal to come. These were not the genetically enhanced warriors of the legions, or the psychically attuned servants of the throne. They were mortals, baseline humans whose only protection would be their love for the broken giant who had led them to freedom. Yet in their faces he saw something that all his science and wisdom had failed to create, unshakable faith born not of indoctrination, but of shared suffering. "So be it," the Emperor said, her gesturing toward smaller interface pedestals that rose from the chamber floor like silver trees. "Take your places. What we do here will echo through eternity, for good or ill." The gladiators moved to their positions with the same quiet confidence they had shown in the fighting pits. Neural interface cables descended from the ceiling like serpents of living metal, their touch gentle as they made contact with human flesh. Corna closed her eyes as the connection was established, her consciousness linking to the vast network that would anchor Angron's healing. One by one, the others followed, their minds becoming nodes in a web of shared experience that stretched across the chamber. Angron approached the central throne with steps that grew heavier with each pace. The nails bit deeper as they sensed the approaching change, flooding his system with chemicals designed to make rational thought impossible. His hands shook with the effort of resisting their influence, but he forced himself onward. Behind him, he could feel the presence of his gladiator family, their minds touching his through the neural link with a warmth he had almost forgotten existed. The moment he settled into the throne's embrace, the world changed. Pain beyond description tore through his skull as the healing matrix began its work, ancient scanners mapping the full extent of the damage with ruthless precision. The butcher's nails had been more than simple implants. They were living things in their own right, neural parasites that had grown into his brain tissue like cancer, feeding off his pain and amplifying his rage until he could barely remember what peace felt like. The extraction process began with the peripheral connections, the smaller neural threads that had wormed their way through his cortex over the decades. Each severed link sent shockwaves through his consciousness, tearing away layers of artificial aggression to reveal the wounds beneath. Angron screamed, not with rage for the first time in memory, but with genuine anguish as the healing matrix burned away the chemical dampeners that had hidden his true emotions. It was then that the memories began to surface, images from a past so distant it might have been another man's life, dredged up from the depths where the nails had tried to bury them forever. Angron saw himself as he had been, before the gladiator pits, before the Nucerian high riders had broken him and rebuilt him as a weapon. He saw a child standing in the ruins of a burned settlement, his small hands pressed against the wounds of a dying woman as he absorbed her pain into himself. The memory unfolded with crystalline clarity, unmarred by the decades of rage and chemical corruption. Young Angron had knelt beside the woman for hours, drawing her suffering into his own body until she could pass peacefully into whatever lay beyond. It had been his gift, his curse, his defining nature before the nails had turned empathy into liability. He had been a healer, not a destroyer, a child who took the pain of others upon himself because he could not bear to see them suffer alone. The healing matrix registered the recovered memory and began to rebuild the neural pathways that had carried such sensations. New connections sparked to life in regions of Angron's brain that had been dormant for decades, synapses firing in patterns that the nails had systematically destroyed. The process was agony beyond description, but it was clean agony, the pain of growth rather than the artificial torture he had endured for so long. More memories surfaced like bubbles rising from the depths of a dark sea. Angron saw himself in the slave barracks of Desher, his empathic abilities allowing him to sense the despair of his fellow captives. He had moved among them like a ghost, offering what comfort he could, absorbing their anguish until it became his own. The gladiator masters had noticed his effect on the other slaves, had seen how his presence calmed the desperate and gave hope to the hopeless. That was when they had decided he needed to be broken. The butcher's nails had been their solution, a crude but effective way to burn the compassion from his mind and replace it with the rage that would make him a killer. They had not simply wanted a gladiator. They had wanted to destroy something beautiful and rebuild it as an instrument of their will. The central nail came away with a sound like tearing metal, its removal sending shockwaves through the neural matrix that made the chamber's lights flicker. Angron's consciousness fragmented for a moment, scattered across 1,000 points of sensation, as his brain struggled to process emotions it had not felt in decades. Fear, hope, sorrow, joy, love, grief. They crashed over him like waves breaking against a shore, each one carrying the weight of years of suppressed experience. Through the link, he felt his gladiator siblings sharing his pain, their mortal minds bearing witness to the agony of a demigod's rebirth. Corner's fierce determination anchored him when the grief threatened to pull him under. Galthan's steady courage gave him strength when the fear of change nearly overwhelmed him. Melek's youthful hope reminded him that not all dreams ended in blood and failure. They held him together when he would have shattered, their love serving as the foundation upon which his restoration could be built. The final connections severed with a crack like breaking thunder, and suddenly Angron could feel. Not the artificial emotional cocktail that the nails had forced upon him, but genuine sensation unmarked by chemical manipulation. He felt the presence of his gladiator family not as distant echoes, but as warm lights in the darkness of his consciousness. Their pain, their hope, their unwavering loyalty. It all flowed through him with an intensity that made him gasp. But more than that, he felt the Emperor's presence like a golden sun at the edge of his awareness. For the first time, he could sense the true nature of the being who claimed to be his father. Ancient beyond measure, burdened with knowledge that would have driven lesser minds to madness, yet still possessed of a love for humanity that burned brighter than stars. The Emperor had made mistakes, had chosen pragmatism over compassion too many times, but beneath the calculated exterior lay a heart that had never stopped believing in the dream of a better future. The healing matrix began its final phase, regenerating the brain tissue that had been destroyed by the nail's presence. New neurons grew like silver threads, weaving themselves into patterns that would allow empathy to flow freely once again. The process would take time to complete, but already Angron could feel the changes taking root. Where there had been only rage and pain, now there was space for other emotions to grow. He opened his eyes for the first time since the procedure had begun, and the world looked different. The golden chamber no longer seemed like a prison, but like a sanctuary where miracles could unfold. The faces of his gladiator family were wet with tears, their relief and joy washing over him like warm rain after a long drought. And the Emperor, his father, stood watching with an expression of profound satisfaction. It was as if a puzzle that had tormented him for millennia had finally been solved. "How do you feel?" the Emperor asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that Angron had never heard before. The Primarch considered the question with a mind that could think clearly for the first time in memory. The rage was still there, but it was his rage now, not the artificial fury of the nails. The pain remained, but it was clean pain, the natural grief of a warrior who had lost too much and seen too many die. And beneath it all, growing stronger with each passing moment, was something he had thought lost forever: the ability to feel another's emotions as clearly as his own. "I feel—" Angron paused, searching for words to describe the indescribable. "I feel like myself again, like the man I was meant to be before they broke me." The Emperor smiled, and for the first time since Angron had been found, it was the smile of a father welcoming home a long-lost son. "Then let us discover together what that man can become." In the depths of the warp, something that had fed on rage and bloodshed for millennia felt its favorite champion slip away like sand through grasping fingers. Khorne's howl of fury shook the foundations of reality, but it could not reach across the veil to reclaim what had been willingly surrendered. For the first time since the galaxy had learned to bleed, the blood god had lost a prize it had claimed as its own. The healing was only the beginning. What came next would test not just Angron's newfound clarity, but the very foundations of an imperium built upon the certainty that some wounds could never heal. Yet in that golden chamber, surrounded by those who loved him, Angron felt something that no amount of rage or pain could destroy: hope. The Red Angel was dead. In his place stood something far more dangerous to the enemies of humanity: a Primarch who could feel the pain of others and had the power to heal it. The first hours after the healing brought revelations that shattered everything Angron thought he understood about existence. The Golden Chamber had become a sanctuary where impossible things took root and grew, but it was also a place of overwhelming sensation. Every emotion from every soul aboard the flagship crashed over him like waves against an unprepared shore, their intensity magnified by decades of enforced numbness. The gladiator's relief sang through his consciousness alongside the custodian's stoic satisfaction, or the tech adept's nervous excitement, and beneath it all, the vast and patient presence of his father's mind. The Emperor watched his son struggle with the sort of attention that had once catalogued the birth of stars. Angron sat hunched in the restoration throne, his massive hands pressed against his temples as he fought to process the tsunami of sensation that threatened to drown his newly awakened consciousness. This was the price of empathy, the burden that the butcher's nails had hidden from him for so long. To feel as others felt was to carry their pain as well as their joy, their fears as well as their hopes. "Focus on one voice at a time," the Emperor said, his mental presence cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. Do not try to hear them all at once. Our empathy without control is merely another form of madness. Angron lifted his head, golden eyes that had blazed with artificial rage now reflecting a depth of emotion that made them seem almost human. I had forgotten, he whispered, his voice hoarse with wonder and pain. I had forgotten what it felt like to truly feel. How did you bear it, Father? How do you carry the weight of billions without breaking under the strain? It was the first time in centuries that Angron had called him Father without sarcasm or rage. The Emperor felt something stir in the depths of his ancient heart, a warmth that he had thought lost to the necessities of rulership and the crushing responsibility of species survival. He moved closer to the throne, his golden radiance dimming to something more approachable as he settled into a chair that materialized from the chamber's responsive architecture. I learned to build walls, the Emperor admitted, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of millennia spent in isolation. Barriers that allowed me to function without being overwhelmed by the suffering I could not immediately relieve. But walls can become prisons, my son. In protecting myself from pain, I may have cut myself off from the very compassion that once drove me to save humanity from itself. They sat in silence for a time, father and son sharing a moment of vulnerability that neither had experienced before. Around them, the healing chamber hummed with gentle purpose as its systems continued their work, repairing neural pathways and rebuilding connections that had been severed for far too long. The gladiators maintained their vigil from their interface pedestals, their presence a constant anchor that helped Angron navigate the overwhelming sea of sensation. It was Corna who first noticed the change in her lord's demeanor. Through the neural link, she felt him reaching out with his restored abilities, tentatively probing the edges of her consciousness. What he found there made him gasp with anguish. The pain she had carried for decades was laid bare before his empathic sight. The agony of countless arena battles, the grief for fallen friends, the bone-deep exhaustion of those who had fought too long without hope of reprieve. "Let me help," Angron said, rising from the throne with movements that seemed almost uncertain. He approached Corna's pedestal and placed his hands on either side of her scarred face, his touch gentle, despite the superhuman strength that could have crushed stone. The connection deepened, and through their link, the others felt their lord drawing Corna's pain into himself, absorbing her suffering as he had once done as a child on Nuceria. The process was not without cost. Angron's face contorted with shared agony as decades of accumulated trauma flowed through him. But he did not pull away. Instead, he bore it willingly, letting Corna's pain become his own, until she could finally breathe without the weight of old wounds pressing against her chest. When he finally withdrew, her eyes were bright with tears of relief, and her breathing came easier than it had in years. "My lord," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "or you should not carry our burdens. We chose this path willingly." Angron's smile was sad but genuine, the expression of someone who had rediscovered a purpose beyond mere survival. "We carry each other's burdens, Corna. That is what family does. That is what we have always done, even when I could not remember why." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation that changed the entire tenor of the chamber. War hounds. 3 captains of Angron's legion strode into the healing sanctuary, their blue and white armor marking them as representatives of the force that had waited decades for their gene father to claim them. Their leader, a scarred veteran whose left arm bore the marks of ancient combat, stopped dead at the sight of the scene before them. Captain Khan of the 8th Assault Company had expected to meet a conqueror, a warrior whose rage would eclipse their own, and whose leadership would transform them into an instrument of perfect destruction. Instead, he found a giant cradling a mortal woman's face in his hands, his expression suffused with a gentleness that seemed utterly alien to everything the warhounds had been told about their Primarch. "My lord," Khan said, his voice carefully neutral, despite the confusion that radiated from every line of his body. "We come bearing greetings from the Legion. Captain Erlin of the 5th Company and Captain Skarn of the 12th stand ready to receive your orders." Angron turned toward them, and the 3 Space Marines felt the full weight of a Primarch's attention fall upon them. Yet it was not the crushing presence of absolute authority they had expected, but something stranger and more unsettling, a gaze that seemed to see into the very depths of their souls, reading their hopes and fears with uncomfortable accuracy. "Warhounds," Angron said, the words carrying both recognition and a sorrow they could not understand. Through his empathic senses, he could feel their expectations pressing against his consciousness like physical weight. They wanted a master of war, a figure of unstoppable fury who would lead them to glorious victory. Instead, they found a healer struggling to reconcile what he had become with what he was meant to be. The Emperor rose from his chair, sensing the tension that crackled through the chamber like electricity before a storm. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "it would be best if I explained the situation to our guests. But Captain Karn, your Primarch, has undergone a procedure that has restored abilities long thought lost. He is not the warrior you were expecting, but he may prove to be something far more valuable to the Imperium." Karn's scarred features remained impassive, but Angron could feel the captain's confusion and growing concern through the empathic link. The warhounds had been bred for battle, shaped by decades of brutal warfare into an instrument of controlled aggression. Their culture revolved around the concept of the nail, the moment when perfect fury overcame rational thought and transformed a warrior into something beyond mortal limitations. To learn that their Primarch had been relieved of such fury, rather than enhanced by it, was almost incomprehensible. "What will become of the Legion?" Karn asked, his voice carrying the weight of thousands of warriors who had defined themselves by their capacity for righteous anger. "We are the Warhounds, my lord. We are bred for battle, shaped for conquest. If you no longer embrace the warrior's path, what purpose do we serve?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Angron felt the expectation of everyone in the chamber pressing against him, their emotions a complex web of hope, fear, and uncertainty. The gladiators trusted him completely, their faith unshaken by his transformation. The Emperor watched with the patience of eternity, waiting to see how his healed son would navigate this first test of leadership. The Warhounds' captains stood ready to follow or to walk away, their loyalty contingent upon finding a purpose they could understand. Angron closed his eyes and reached out with his restored abilities, feeling for the emotional undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of the 3 Space Marines' consciousness. What he found there surprised him. Beneath their warriors' pride and their hunger for battle lay something else, a deep and abiding pain that spoke of losses too numerous to count, of brothers fallen in campaigns whose purpose had been forgotten, of victories that felt hollow because they had been purchased with so much blood. "You ask what purpose you serve," Angron said, opening his eyes to meet each captain's gaze in turn. "You serve the same purpose you have always served, but perhaps you will serve it differently. You are protectors, guardians of those who cannot protect themselves. The difference is that now you might learn to fight not just with your weapons, but with your hearts." He gestured toward the gladiators who had shared his healing. "These warriors taught me that true strength comes not from the absence of pain, but from the willingness to bear it in service of something greater than ourselves. They showed me that loyalty is not born of fear or dominance, but of shared suffering and mutual sacrifice. If the Legion can learn these truths, then perhaps we can become something more than mere instruments of destruction." Captain Erlin stepped forward, his voice carrying a note of challenge that spoke to the war leader he had once been. "And if the galaxy requires destruction, my lord, if there are enemies who cannot be reasoned with, threats that can only be answered with violence, will your newfound compassion serve the Imperium when the killing must be done?" Angron's smile was grim, but it carried no trace of the artificial madness that had once defined him. "Then we will kill them, Captain. But we will kill them cleanly, efficiently, and without losing ourselves in the process. We will remember that every life taken is a tragedy, even when it is a necessary one. We will fight not because we love war, but because we love what war protects." The Emperor watched this exchange with something approaching pride. His son had found a middle path between the extremes of pacifism and bloodlust, a way to preserve both strength and compassion in a galaxy that demanded both. Yet he could also feel the resistance that Angron's words generated in the Warhound's captains. They had been shaped by decades of a very different philosophy, and change would not come easily to them. "The choice is yours," Angron continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "I will not force this path upon you. If you cannot serve under a leader who values restraint as much as aggression, then perhaps it would be better if you found another legion that better suits your nature. But if you are willing to try, to learn what it means to be warriors in service of something greater than conquest, then I will teach you everything I have learned." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and uncertainty. Captain Khan exchanged glances with his fellow officers, their faces reflecting the magnitude of the decision that lay before them. Or to accept Angron's leadership would mean abandoning everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be warhounds. To refuse would mean losing their Primarch before they had truly found him. It was Khan who finally broke the silence, his scarred features set with the determination that had carried him through 100 battlefields. "Then teach us, my lord. Show us what you have learned, and we will judge for ourselves whether it has merit. The Warhounds have followed stranger paths than this, and found glory in the end." Angron nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the healing chamber's technology. For the first time since his transformation, he began to believe that the future might hold something more than an endless cycle of violence and regret. There would be challenges ahead, resistance from those who preferred the old ways, and enemies who would seek to exploit what they saw as weakness. But there would also be hope, the possibility that even in the grim darkness of the far future, compassion might find a way to flourish. The Emperor rose from his chair, his ancient eyes bright with an emotion that might have been pride. "Then let us begin this work in earnest. There is much to teach and much to learn, and the galaxy will not wait for us to find our way." As the assembled company prepared to leave the healing chamber, none of them noticed the subtle shift in the warp currents that surrounded the flagship. In the depths of the imperium, powers older than civilization felt the change that had been wrought and began to plan their response. What the healing of Angron was more than just the restoration of a single soul. It was the first note in a symphony that might one day drown out the screams of an eternally warring galaxy. But that was a concern for another day. For now, there was only the warm glow of possibility, and the quiet satisfaction that came from choosing healing over hatred, growth over stagnation, hope over despair. The Red Angel was dead, and in his place stood something the galaxy had never seen before, a Primarch who remembered how to love. The news traveled through the warp like ripples across still water, carried by astropathic choirs whose minds strained to convey something that defied easy understanding. Angron lived. More than that, he had been changed, transformed from the rage-maddened gladiator of Nuceria into something that the Imperium had never seen before, a Primarch who remembered how to heal. Across the galaxy, his brothers felt the psychic tremors of his restoration and began to converge on the Emperor's flagship with a mixture of curiosity, hope, and deep suspicion. Guilliman arrived first, his fleet translating from the warp with the mechanical precision that marked all of his endeavors. The Lord of Ultramar had been prosecuting a campaign against the Orc-War of Scarjaw when the astropathic message reached him, its contents so extraordinary that he had abandoned a nearly completed conquest to witness the miracle for himself. As his shuttle approached the Emperor's flagship, Robert Guilliman found himself wrestling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel, hope tempered by skepticism, and beneath it all, a deep longing for the brother he had never truly known. The reunion took place in the flagship's strategium, a vast chamber lined with star charts and tactical displays that showed the current state of the Great Crusade. Angron stood at the central holotable, his massive frame no longer radiating the constant tension of barely contained fury. Instead, there was a stillness about him, a sense of focused calm that seemed almost alien to those who knew his reputation. When Guilliman entered, flanked by his honor guard, Angron looked up from the tactical displays with eyes that held depths of emotion rather than the flat rage his brothers had learned to expect. "Robot," Angron said, his voice carrying a warmth that made the Lord of Ultramar stop in his tracks. "It has been too long since we spoke, as brothers should." Guilliman's analytical mind catalogued the differences immediately. The constant microtremors that had always marked Angron's presence were gone, replaced by the controlled grace of someone in full command of their faculties. More than that, there was something in his brother's expression that spoke of genuine pleasure at their reunion, an emotion that the butcher's nails had never permitted. "The reports spoke truth, then," Guilliman said, approaching the holotable with measured steps. "You have been healed." Angron's smile carried a sadness that spoke of decades lost to artificial rage and chemical madness. "I have been restored to what I was meant to be. Yes, though I fear the price of that restoration was higher than anyone should have to pay." Through his empathic senses, Angron could feel his brother's emotional state with crystalline clarity. Guilliman's mind was a fortress of order and logic, but beneath the carefully constructed walls lay a well of loneliness that resonated with Angron's own sense of isolation. The Lord of Ultramar had built an empire of efficiency and justice, but in doing so had cut himself off from the simple human connections that might have brought him peace. "You feel it too," Angron said quietly, his empathic perception reaching out to touch the edges of Guilliman's consciousness. The weight of responsibility that makes every decision a burden, on every victory a step further from the man you might have been in a simpler world. Guilliman's eyes widened slightly as he felt the gentle probe of his brother's restored abilities. It was not an invasion, but rather an offered hand reaching across the void that separated one soul from another. For a moment, he allowed himself to lower his defenses and feel the warmth of genuine understanding flowing between them. "I had not expected this," Guilliman admitted, his usual formal precision softening into something more human. "The Angron I knew was different, consumed by a rage that made conversation nearly impossible. To find you like this, to feel your presence as it is now." He paused, searching for words that could encompass the magnitude of the change he witnessed. "Yet it gives me hope that perhaps we might truly know each other, as brothers should." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Vulcan, the salamander dark primarch, striding into the strategium with the sort of joy that seemed to light the very air around him. Unlike Guilliman's careful approach, Vulcan crossed the chamber in great bounding steps and swept Angron into an embrace that would have crushed lesser men. The empathic contact was immediate and overwhelming, Vulcan's pure-hearted warmth crashing over Angron like a tide of liquid gold. "Brother!" Vulcan roared, his voice echoing off the chamber's vaulted ceiling. "The moment I felt the change in the warp currents, I knew something miraculous had occurred. To see you whole, to feel the warmth of your soul burning bright once more, it is a gift beyond price." Angron returned the embrace with equal fervor, his empathic abilities drinking in the uncomplicated joy that radiated from Vulcan's being. Here was a brother whose heart had never been clouded by cynicism or tainted by the necessities of rulership. Vulcan loved freely and completely, his emotions as pure and genuine as the flames he commanded. In his presence, Angron felt some of the guilt and anguish that had plagued him since his healing began to fade. "Vulcan," Angron whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be in the presence of someone whose soul burned so clean and bright. Your joy is like sunlight to someone who has lived too long in darkness." The moment of warmth was shattered by the arrival of Horus, or the War Master's presence filling the strategium with the sort of authority that made even his brothers straighten unconsciously. Yet Angron's empathic senses detected something else beneath the perfect facade, a flicker of jealousy so carefully hidden that it would have escaped any normal perception. Horus had been the first found, the chosen son who had stood at the Emperor's side for decades. To see another brother receiving such unprecedented attention, such obvious care and healing, stirred something dark in the depths of his perfect exterior. "So the prodigal son returns," Horus said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to seem genuine, while concealing the bitter undertone that Angron's abilities detected immediately. "Father has worked a miracle indeed, to restore what was thought forever lost." Angron studied his brother's face, seeing through the mask of fraternal affection to the complex web of emotions that churned beneath. Horus was not evil. Not yet. But there were shadows growing in his heart that spoke of pride wounded and loyalty strained. The empathic revelation was troubling, but Angron chose to respond to the surface, meaning rather than the hidden depths. "Not restored," Angron corrected gently. "Reborn, perhaps. I am not the same man who stood in the gladiator pits of Nuteria, nor am I the rage-mad creature who might have led a legion into endless slaughter. I am something new, something that seeks to build rather than destroy." Horus's smile never wavered, but Angron felt the spike of irritation that his words provoked. What the War Master had built his identity around being the perfect son, the ideal general, the chosen heir. To hear another brother speak of transcending their original nature touched on fears that Horus had buried so deep he might not even recognize them himself. The tension was broken by the arrival of Magnus, the Crimson King sweeping into the strategium with robes that seemed to shift and flow like liquid flame. His psychic presence was immediately apparent to Angron's empathic senses, a brilliant beacon of knowledge and curiosity that blazed with the intensity of a star. Yet beneath the intellectual fire lay currents of loneliness and isolation that resonated deeply with Angron's own experience of alienation. "Fascinating," Magnus said without preamble, his single eye fixing on Angron with an intensity that would have been uncomfortable if not for the genuine warmth that accompanied it. "The neural restoration matrix has not simply repaired the damage caused by the butcher's nails, but has actually enhanced your natural empathic abilities beyond their original scope. The implications are significant." Angron felt a moment of recognition pass between them, two brothers who had been shaped by forces beyond their control and who now struggled to define themselves in the aftermath. "You understand," he said simply, "what it means to have your nature twisted by others, to fight to reclaim what was taken from you." Magnus nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "Indeed. If you are willing, I would offer my assistance in stabilizing these newfound abilities, or the warp currents around you are turbulent. Without proper guidance, empathy of such intensity could become as much a burden as the nails ever were." The offer was genuine, Angron realized, born not of scientific curiosity, but of a brother's concern for his well-being. Magnus knew what it was like to bear psychic gifts that could easily become curses, and he sought to spare Angron the isolation that such power often demanded. "I would welcome such assistance," Angron replied, inclining his head in gratitude. "I have much to learn about controlling what has been restored to me." The final arrival was Perturabo, the Iron Warrior stomping into the strategium with the measured tread of a siege engine given life. His presence was like cold iron, rigid and unyielding, shaped by decades of thankless warfare and unacknowledged sacrifice. Through his empathic abilities, Angron felt the bitter resentment that Perturabo carried like armor, the deep conviction that he was unloved and unappreciated despite his countless victories. "Another of Father's pet projects," Perturabo said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Tell me, brother, what makes your healing so special? What makes your pain worth the expenditure of archaeotech that could have saved thousands of lesser men?" The words carried a sting that went beyond mere sarcasm. Perturabo's resentment was real and deep, born of a lifetime spent building and destroying in equal measure while receiving only demands for more. He saw Angron's healing not as a miracle, but as evidence of favoritism that confirmed his darkest suspicions about the Emperor's regard for his sons. Angron felt the urge to respond with anger, yet to defend himself against the accusation implicit in his brother's words. But his empathic senses showed him the source of Perturabo's bitterness, a heart that had been wounded by neglect, and a spirit that craved acknowledgement for sacrifices that went unseen. Instead of anger, Angron felt only compassion for a brother who had built walls around himself so high that he could no longer see the sky. "You are right to question the expenditure," Angron said quietly, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness that Perturabo had expected. "My healing came at a cost that could have saved many others. I do not know why Father chose to spend such resources on one broken son when the galaxy burns with needs that go unmet. But I intend to prove worthy of that investment, to use what has been restored to me in service of something greater than my own redemption." The unexpected response seemed to take some of the wind from Perturabo's sails. He had come prepared for defensiveness or anger, not the quiet acknowledgement of his concerns. For a moment, his rigid exterior softened enough to reveal the wounded idealist that lay beneath. The Emperor entered the strategium as if summoned by the completion of the gathering, his golden presence immediately drawing the attention of all present. In the wake of his arrival, the chamber seemed to hum with potential, as if the very air recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. Behind him came a procession of custodians and senior staff officers, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. "My sons," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, tempered by genuine warmth. "You have come to witness what may be the first step in a transformation that extends far beyond a single soul. Today, we convene the first War Council, where strategy will be guided not only by tactical necessity, but by the moral imperatives that should govern all our actions." The holotable blazed to life, displaying a sector of space where Imperial forces were engaged with a Xenos empire that had refused all offers of compliance. The tactical situation was clear. A swift and brutal assault would shatter their resistance within days, but at the cost of billions of civilian lives. The traditional approach would be to overwhelm their defenses and sort out the survivors later, if any remained. "The Aelari Conclave has rejected our ultimatum," the Emperor explained, gesturing to the tactical display. "Their military forces are concentrated around 3 key systems, leaving their civilian populations largely undefended. Standard doctrine would call for simultaneous strikes against all 3, crippling their ability to coordinate resistance." Horus stepped forward, his tactical genius immediately grasping the implications. A 3-pronged assault would end the campaign in days with minimal Imperial casualties. The Xenos chose their path when they rejected compliance. "Acceptable losses in pursuit of swift victory," Guilliman agreed, though his voice carried a note of reluctance. "The longer we allow resistance to continue, or the more Imperial lives will be lost in protracted warfare." It was Angron who spoke into the silence that followed, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even himself. "And what of the civilian populations who had no voice in their leader's decision to resist? Are their lives forfeit because they were born under the rule of those who chose defiance over submission?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Great Crusade had taken for granted. Horus's eyes narrowed slightly, while Perturabo made a sound that might have been a snort of derision. Yet Vulcan and Magnus both nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the moral complexity that Angron had raised. "You propose an alternative?" the Emperor asked, his ancient eyes fixed on his newly healed son with an expression of intense interest. Angron studied the tactical display, his enhanced empathy allowing him to sense the emotions of the billions whose fates hung in the balance. Fear, confusion, hope, despair. It all flowed through his consciousness like a tide of shared sensation that made the weight of command feel heavier than any armor. "Precision strikes," he said finally. "Target their military leadership and infrastructure while leaving civilian areas untouched. It will take longer, require more careful planning, but it preserves the lives of those who might one day become loyal citizens of the Imperium rather than martyrs to Xenos resistance." "And if they use human shields?" Perturabo challenged. "If they place their command centers in population centers specifically to exploit such scruples?" Angron's smile was grim but determined. "Then we find another way. We are Primarchs, brothers. We are supposed to be capable of more than simple butchery. If we cannot protect the innocent while defeating the guilty, then what separates us from the monsters we claim to fight?" The silence that followed was heavy with implications that stretched far beyond a single campaign. The Emperor watched his sons wrestle with questions that had no easy answers, seeing in their struggle the birth of something that might one day grow into wisdom. It was Magnus who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the question is not whether we can afford to show such restraint, but whether we can afford not to. Every civilian we save is a life that might one day contribute to the dream we seek to build. Every unnecessary death is a seed of resentment that may grow into future rebellion." Vulcan nodded vigorously, his perpetual optimism seizing on the possibility of a path that honored both duty and compassion. "If we are to build an imperium worthy of humanity's allegiance, we must show them that we value their lives, not merely their compliance." The War Council continued deep into the ship's night cycle, 5 Primarchs and their father wrestling with questions that would define not just a single campaign, but the moral foundation upon which the Imperium would either stand or fall. And at the heart of it all sat Angron, the former gladiator, whose healing had opened doorways to possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine. The galaxy was vast and cruel, filled with threats that demanded swift and decisive action. Yet perhaps, as in the space between necessity and brutality, there might be room for something more, the hope that strength and compassion need not be enemies, but might instead become the twin pillars upon which a better future could be built. The great amphitheater aboard the flagship Invincible Reason had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate the first formal address of a Primarch to his legion. 10,000 Space Marines of the Warhounds stood in perfect formation, their blue and white armor gleaming under the harsh illumination of overhead lumens. Yet beneath the veneer of military precision lay currents of tension that threatened to tear the Legion apart at its foundation. Word of their Gene Father's transformation had spread through the ranks like wildfire, creating divisions that ran deeper than any enemy blade could cut. Angron stood upon the raised dais at the amphitheater's heart, his massive frame no longer radiating the constant fury that had defined him for so long. The change was immediately apparent to every warrior present, though few could articulate exactly what they were witnessing. Where once there had been barely contained rage, now there was a stillness that spoke of profound self-control. Where once his presence had been like standing too close to a furnace, now it was like basking in the warmth of a hearth fire, comforting rather than threatening. "My sons," Angron began, his voice carrying across the amphitheater without amplification, "you have waited decades for this moment, dreaming of the day when your Gene Father would stand before you and lead you to glory. I come to you not as the conqueror you expected, but as something perhaps more valuable, a teacher who has learned the difference between strength and brutality. The reaction was immediate and divided. In the front ranks, Captain Khan and his supporters maintained their disciplined attention, though the younger captain's scarred features reflected a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Behind them, other captains exchanged glances that spoke of skepticism and growing concern. Scattered throughout the formation were Marines whose temples bore the telltale scars of neural implantation, those who had already embraced the butcher's nails in emulation of their gene father's perceived nature. "Many of you have heard tales of the gladiator pits of Nuceria," Angron continued, his empathic senses reading the emotional currents that flowed through his assembled legion. "Or you have been told that those pits forged me into the perfect warrior, that the devices embedded in my skull were tools of enhancement rather than instruments of torture. Today, I tell you the truth that has been hidden beneath decades of artificial rage." He gestured toward his scarred temples, where fresh surgical marks showed the sites of the removed implants. The butcher's nails were not gifts but chains, not enhancements, but parasites that fed upon my capacity for rational thought and emotional control. They turned me into a slave to fury, a creature driven by impulses I could not control. What you saw as strength was merely the death throes of my true nature. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that stretched far beyond a single legion's identity. Captain Dreger of the 3rd Company stepped forward, his own scarred temples marking him as one of those who had sought to emulate their gene father's perceived greatness. His voice carried the weight of thousands who had made the same choice, seeking strength through surgical modification. "My lord," Dreger said, his words measured but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. "You speak of chains and slavery, but we who bear the nails have found liberation in their gift. The clarity of purpose they provide, the freedom from doubt and hesitation. Surely these are weapons as valuable as any blade." Angron's heart ached as he felt the chemical addiction that pulsed through Dreger's nervous system, the artificial rewards that the nails provided for aggressive behavior. Through his empathic abilities, he could sense the captain's genuine belief that he had been enhanced, or even as the devices slowly consumed the neural pathways that might have made him something greater than a mere killer. "You feel liberated because the nails have stolen your ability to recognize your own imprisonment," Angron replied, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to surprise the assembled warriors. "They reward violence with pleasure, while burning away your capacity for the more subtle emotions that make us human. You are not free, my son. You are addicted to a chemical lie that tells you that rage is the only emotion worth feeling." The amphitheater erupted in murmurs of confusion and anger as Marines struggled to process what they were hearing. Some nodded in recognition, remembering brothers who had changed after receiving the implants, or becoming more aggressive and less capable of the complex thinking that marked the finest space Marines. Others recoiled from the implications, their identity too closely tied to the neural modifications to accept that they might have been deceived. Captain Korn stepped forward, his voice cutting through the growing chaos with the authority of his rank and the respect his decades of service had earned. "My lord speaks truth," he declared, his words carrying across the amphitheater like a clarion call. "I have served alongside brothers both with and without the nails, and I have seen the differences they create. Those who bear them fight with fury, yes, but they also struggle to adapt when tactics require subtlety or restraint." The statement sent shockwaves through the assembled legion. For Khan was known as one of their finest warriors, a captain whose tactical acumen was matched only by his personal courage. If he supported their gene father's position, then perhaps there was truth in the claims that the nails were more hindrance than help. Yet not all were convinced. Captain Garland of the 7th Company, his own temples bearing fresh scars from recent implantation, stepped forward with the sort of aggressive posture that the nails encouraged. "And what of those of us who have already chosen this path?" he demanded. "Are we to be discarded as defective? Abandoned by a gene father who no longer values the strength we have sacrificed to achieve? The question struck at the heart of the division that threatened to tear the Legion apart. Those who had embraced the Nails had done so out of loyalty to their Primarch's perceived nature, seeking to become more like the warrior they believed him to be. To learn that their sacrifice had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Angron descended from the dais, his enhanced senses reading the complex web of emotions that pulsed through the amphitheater. Fear, anger, confusion, hope, all of it crashed over him like waves against a shore, threatening to overwhelm his still-developing control. Yet he pressed forward, driven by the need to heal the wounds that his own ignorance had helped to create. "You are not defective," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "You are my sons, each and every one of you, regardless of what modifications you have chosen to embrace. The question is not whether I value your strength, but whether that strength serves the purpose for which it was intended." He paused beside Captain Garland, his empathic abilities revealing the young officer's pain and confusion with crystalline clarity. Beneath the artificial aggression lay a warrior who had sought only to serve his gene father well, who had endured the agony of neural implantation out of love and loyalty rather than any hunger for violence. "The Nails can be removed," Angron said quietly, his words meant for Garland, but carrying to the entire assembly. "The process is dangerous and painful, but it is possible. You need not remain chained to devices that steal your potential. But the choice must be yours. Oh, freely made and without coercion." The offer sent ripples of shock through the Legion's ranks. Some warriors stepped forward immediately, their faces reflecting the hope that they might be freed from modifications they had come to see as burdens rather than gifts. Others recoiled, their addiction to the neural rewards making the prospect of removal seem like a form of death. "And if we choose to keep them?" Dreager asked, his voice tight with the sort of tension that the Nails generated in response to emotional stress. "If we believe that our strength lies in the path we have already chosen?" Angron's expression grew sad but determined. "Then you will serve as you see fit. But you will not serve in roles that require the sort of thinking the Nails make impossible. You will be warriors, yes, but you will not be leaders of men. You will fight when fighting is needed, but you will not make decisions that affect the lives of those under your command." The pronouncement was like a blade cutting through the Legion's command structure. Those who retained their Nails would be relegated to the role of specialized assault troops, valuable in their limited sphere, but unable to rise to positions of true authority. It was not exile, but it was a recognition that their modifications made them unsuitable for the complex demands of modern warfare. Captain Khan stepped forward once more, his voice carrying the weight of decision that would shape the Legion's future. "I volunteer to be the first," he declared. "If the removal process can free me from dependencies I never knew I carried, well, then I will undergo it gladly." The statement sent another shock wave through the assembly, for Khan was beloved by warriors on both sides of the growing divide. His willingness to risk the removal procedure gave credibility to their gene father's claims in a way that no amount of argument could have achieved. Yet the decision also crystallized the opposition. Captain Dreger's face darkened with an expression that was part fury and part betrayal. "So be it," he said, his voice carrying the bitter edge that the Nails gave to all strong emotion. "Those of us who value strength above sentiment will remember who stood with the true warrior's path." The lines were drawn with a clarity that made compromise impossible. On one side stood those willing to risk the removal of their neural implants in pursuit of their full potential. But on the other stood those who had embraced the Nails so completely that they could not imagine existence without them. Between them yawned a chasm that would fundamentally alter the nature of the Legion. Angron felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like armor, forged from regret and determination. He had not chosen to be found in this manner, had not asked for the burden of healing a legion divided by his own past mistakes. Yet the burden was his to bear, and he would carry it with whatever wisdom his restoration had granted him. "The galaxy is vast and cruel," he said, his voice carrying across the amphitheater one final time. "It demands warriors who can think as well as fight, who can show mercy as well as strength, who can build as well as destroy. Those who choose the path of healing will learn to be such warriors. Those who choose to remain as they are will serve in whatever capacity their nature allows." The assembly began to dissolve as warriors made their way to processing stations, where medical personnel waited to assess their neural implants and explain the risks of removal. Some moved with eager determination, others with reluctant resignation. A significant minority remained in their original positions, their body language making clear their intention to retain the modifications that had become central to their identity. As the amphitheater slowly emptied, Angron remained on the dais, his empathic senses still processing the complex emotional aftermath of what had just occurred. He had succeeded in offering his sons a choice, but he had also fractured the unity that had sustained them through decades of warfare. The future would tell whether the division he had created would prove to be a source of strength or weakness. Captain Khan approached the dais as the last of the assembled Marines departed, his scarred features reflecting a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying the respect that had never wavered, despite the revolutionary changes of the day. "What you offer is not without risk. The removal process may fail, may leave us diminished rather than enhanced." Angron's smile was sad but genuine. "All growth requires risk, my son. The question is whether we have the courage to pursue what we might become, rather than clinging to what we have always been." The captain nodded slowly, his decision already made, but requiring acknowledgement nonetheless. "Then let us discover together what the true warhounds might be capable of achieving." In the depths of space, the first campaign of the transformed legion began to take shape. The precision strikes that Angron had advocated in the War Council were about to be put to the test, with reformed and unmodified warriors fighting side by side against enemies who expected the traditional hammer blow of imperial assault. The galaxy would judge whether compassion and tactical precision could achieve what raw fury had accomplished through sheer overwhelming force. The warhounds were becoming something new. Whether that transformation would save them or destroy them remained to be seen. The warp convulsed with a fury that had not been felt since the birth of the first star. As in the realm where thought became substance and emotion took physical form, something ancient and terrible roared its displeasure across dimensions that mortal minds could never comprehend. Khorne, the blood god, lord of skulls and master of endless slaughter, felt the severing of a connection that had sustained him for decades. His chosen champion, the Red Angel who had fed him oceans of blood and mountains of skulls, had slipped from his grasp like sand through grasping fingers. The brass throne shook as the god of war and murder rose to his full terrible height, his form towering above the endless battlefields where the souls of the violent dead fought for eternity. Where Angron's presence had once blazed like a beacon of pure rage, there was now only an empty void that spoke of loss beyond calculation. The Primarch's fury had been transformed into something far more dangerous to the powers of chaos, controlled purpose, guided by empathy and wisdom. Across the galaxy, warp storms began to manifest as Khorne's rage sent tremors through the Imperium. Navigation became treacherous as Geller fields strained against the unusual turbulence, and astropaths screamed themselves hoarse as they tried to maintain communication through the psychic maelstrom. On 1,000 worlds, those sensitive to the warp felt the disturbance as a physical pain, a cosmic howl of loss that spoke of powers beyond mortal understanding. Aboard the flagship where Angron had been healed, the first signs of supernatural retaliation began to manifest. The ship's Geller field flickered as something immense pressed against the barrier between realities, seeking entry into the physical realm. Ancient wards carved into the vessel's hull blazed with protective light as they strained to maintain the sanctity of the space within. Tech adepts monitoring the psychic defenses reported fluctuations that defied all known parameters. Angron felt the disturbance before any instrument could detect it, his newly restored empathic abilities picking up the psychic pressure like a physical weight against his consciousness. The sensation was familiar, yet fundamentally changed. Where once he had felt the nails responding to such warp-born fury with chemical pleasure, now he experienced only a deep sadness for the waste and corruption that such rage represented. "Father," he said, entering the Emperor's private chambers where the master of mankind stood before a vast viewing port, watching the stars wheel slowly past. "Something stirs in the warp. Something that knows what has been done here and does not approve." The Emperor turned from his contemplation, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that had been gathered across millennia. He had felt the disturbance as well, recognized it for what it was, the fury of a god whose most valuable asset had been stripped away by forces beyond its reach. "Khorne mourns the loss of his champion," he said simply. "The blood god invested much in your corruption, and he will not surrender his claim without a fight." The conversation was interrupted by the ship's emergency klaxons, their harsh wail cutting through the chamber like the cry of a wounded beast. Through the viewing port, what impossible shapes began to materialize in the void around the flagship, crimson tears in reality itself that bled demonic essence into the physical realm. The first wave of retaliation had begun. Demons of Khorne poured through the warp rifts like blood from a severed artery, their brass armor gleaming in the light of distant stars. Bloodletters wielded hell-forged blades that burned with the fury of their patron god, while massive bloodthirsters spread wings that blotted out entire sections of Starfield. They came not for conquest or simple slaughter, but with a specific purpose: to reclaim the soul of the one who had served their master so faithfully for so long. The flagship's defenses opened fire immediately, lance batteries and macro cannons sending streams of destructive energy into the demonic host. So yet for every demon that was banished back to the warp, 2 more took its place, the tide of cornet fury seemingly endless. The Emperor's custodians deployed throughout the ship, their auramite armor blazing with protective wards as they prepared to defend their lord's vessel against an incursion from the realm of nightmares. Angron stood at the center of the storm, his consciousness suddenly assaulted by voices that spoke directly to his mind without passing through his ears. The demons called to him in languages that predated human speech, their words carrying promises of power, offers of redemption, and threats of consequences for his abandonment of the warrior's path. "Come back to us, Red Angel," the voices whispered, carrying the weight of brass bells and the screaming of the eternally damned. "Return to the glory of endless battle, to the purity of rage untempered by weakness. Your father offers you healing, but we offer you strength without limit, fury without end." The temptation was real, made more potent by the part of him that remembered the simplicity of the nails-driven existence. There had been a terrible freedom in having no choice but to kill, no burden but to serve the next opportunity for violence. The complexity of empathy, the weight of feeling others' pain as his own, seemed almost unbearable when compared to the chemical certainty that the butcher's nails had provided, yet the moment of temptation passed as quickly as it had come, swept away by the presence of those who anchored him to his new reality. Khorne appeared at his side, her scarred features set with determination as she took his hand in hers. Through their connection, he felt not just her loyalty, but her hope, the quiet faith of someone who had watched him suffer for decades and now dared to believe that he might finally find peace. "My lord," she said, her voice cutting through the demonic whispers like a blade of pure steel, Remember who you are now, not who you were forced to be. These creatures offer nothing but the chains you have already broken." One by one, the other gladiator survivors joined them, their presence creating a circle of mortal determination around their transformed lord. Through his empathic abilities, Angron felt their emotions washing over him like a tide of cleansing fire. Love, loyalty, hope, and beneath it all, an unshakable faith in the man he had chosen to become. The first demon to breach the ship's interior defenses came for him directly, its massive form tearing through bulkheads as if they were made of parchment rather than adamantium. The bloodthirster stood 3 times Angron's height, its wings spread wide, and its brass sword trailing flames that burned with the fury of a dying star. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of cosmic authority. "Angron of Nuceria," the daemon said, its words echoing through dimensions both physical and psychic. "You were promised to my master in the moment the first nail pierced your skull. Your service was bought with decades of glorious slaughter, paid for in the blood of countless enemies. Return to your true nature, or face the consequences of betraying a god." Angron looked upon the creature that had once inspired him to heights of violence beyond mortal comprehension, and felt only pity for the hollow existence it represented. Where once he might have met its challenge with roaring fury, now he responded with the sort of calm authority that came from genuine self-knowledge. "I was never yours," he replied, his voice carrying across the chamber with absolute conviction. "I was stolen from myself by devices that turned my greatest gift into my most terrible weakness. What you call betrayal, I call healing. What you name abandonment, I name growth." The bloodthirster's response was predictable, a howl of rage that shattered reinforced windows and sent shockwaves through the ship's superstructure. It charged with the speed of a falling meteor, as its brass sword aimed directly at Angron's heart. Yet the Primarch did not meet the charge with violence of his own. Instead, he reached out with his empathic abilities, feeling for the core of pain and rage that drove the demon's existence. What he found there surprised him. Beneath the layers of supernatural fury and cosmic authority lay something that might once have been mortal, a soul so consumed by anger and violence that it had lost all memory of what it had originally been. The daemon was not a conqueror or a god, but a victim of the very forces it now served, trapped in an existence that offered only the endless repetition of the same destructive patterns. "I see you," Angron whispered, his words somehow reaching the creature even as it bore down upon him with murderous intent. "I see what you were before the rage consumed you, before you became a slave to fury rather than its master. You could be more than this. You could choose a different path." The effect was immediate and devastating. The bloodthirster stumbled in its charge, its brass sword wavering as something deep within its corrupted essence responded to Angron's empathic touch. For a single moment, the creature remembered what it had been before. Khorne's influence had burned away everything that was not rage and violence. The memory was brief, lasting only heartbeats, but it was enough to create a crack in the daemon's supernatural armor. The Emperor struck in that moment of hesitation, his power flowing through the ship's defensive systems to banish the wavering demon back to the warp. Yet the true victory was not in the creature's destruction, but in the revelation that even the servants of chaos could be reached by the sort of empathy that Angron now wielded. As the immediate threat passed, and the remaining demons were either banished or destroyed, Angron found his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of the flagship. His empathic abilities, enhanced by the stress of combat and the proximity of warp-spawned entities, reached out across the void to touch the minds of others who sailed the galaxy in service to the Imperium. What he found there sent chills of recognition through his restored soul. On distant ships and far-flung worlds, he sensed the subtle taint of chaos corruption beginning to take root in minds that should have been pure. The whispers were quiet still, more suggestion than command, but they carried the same seductive promise that he had just rejected. The power without limit, strength without conscience, the freedom that came from surrendering moral choice to a higher authority. One presence stood out among all the others, a mind that blazed with charisma and authority, but carried shadows that spoke of growing discontent. Horus, the War Master, the first found and most beloved of the Primarchs, showed signs of corruption so subtle that they might have gone unnoticed by any save one who had been touched by chaos himself. "Father," Angron said, his voice heavy with the weight of unwelcome knowledge, "there are others. The demons did not come only for me. They came because something larger is stirring. I sense darkness growing where there should be light. Brothers whose loyalty wavers though they may not yet know it themselves." The Emperor's face grew grave as he processed the implications of his son's revelation. The healing of Angron had been intended as a beginning, the first step in a process that might eventually see all the Primarchs restored to their full potential. Yet, if chaos was already at work among his sons, if the corruption had begun to spread while he focused on saving one brother, then time might be shorter than any of them had imagined. "Show me," the Emperor commanded, his mental presence joining with Angron's empathic consciousness, as together they reached out across the galaxy. Through their combined perception, the scope of the threat became clear. Not open rebellion. Not yet, but the foundations upon which such rebellion might be built. Doubt, resentment, pride, to ambition, all the human emotions that the Chaos powers used as doorways into mortal hearts. The session left both father and son drained, their consciousness returning to the physical realm with a weight of knowledge that neither had wanted to bear. The galaxy stood on the edge of a precipice, balanced between the dream of unity that the Great Crusade promised and the nightmare of civil war that chaos sought to create. "It may already be too late to save them all," the Emperor said, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of the burden of perfect knowledge. "But perhaps with your gift restored, we might save enough to make the difference between triumph and catastrophe." Angron nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like armor forged from hope and tempered by determination. The healing that had been intended as a personal restoration had become something far more significant, a weapon in the war for the very soul of humanity. The question was whether love and empathy could triumph over rage and corruption, whether the bonds of brotherhood could withstand the corrosive whispers of gods who fed on conflict. In the depths of the warp, Khorne's fury continued to shake the foundations of reality. Yet for the first time in eons, the blood god felt something that might have been fear. His lost champion had become something more dangerous than any warrior. He had become a healer who could reach into the very hearts of corruption and offer redemption to those who had forgotten. It was possible. The war for Angron's soul was over. The war for the souls of his brothers was just beginning. The astropathic message that reached Angron 3 days after the demon incursion carried a weight that had nothing to do with its brevity. 4 words, transmitted across the void by a mind strained to breaking. "Come to Kolchis. Brother needs." The sender was unknown, but the destination was clear, and through his enhanced empathic senses, Angron could feel the psychic resonance of genuine anguish that had powered the transmission. Somewhere in the galaxy, one of his brothers was suffering, and the pain was deep enough to reach across the stars. The journey to Kolchis took the better part of a week, the flagship's navigators struggling to find clear paths through warp currents, still disturbed by Khorne's fury. Yet as they approached the word-bearer's home system, Angron began to sense something that made the blood god's rage seem simple by comparison. Where Khorne's influence was like a bonfire, obvious and brutally direct, what touched Kolchis was more like a poison, slowly seeping through clean water, corrupting everything it contacted with a subtlety that made it all the more dangerous. Lorgar met him at the landing platform of Varadesh, the sprawling city that served as the capital of the Word-Bearer's domain. The reunion should have been joyful, two brothers united after the miracle of Angron's healing. Yet the moment Angron saw his sibling's face, he knew that something was terribly wrong. Lorgar had always been the most spiritual of the Primarchs, the one whose faith burned brighter than the twin suns of his homeworld. Yet now that faith seemed tainted, or twisted into shapes that hurt to look upon with empathic sight. "Brother," Lorgar said, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to weigh down the very air around them. "I felt the change in you across the void, the restoration of what was lost. Yet I fear that my own spirit grows darker, even as yours finds the light." Through his restored abilities, Angron could sense the complex web of emotions that churned beneath Lorgar's surface composure. Faith warred with doubt, hope struggled against despair, and beneath it all lay a growing hunger for meaning that seemed to be feeding on itself like a flame, consuming its own fuel. More troubling still were the subtle influences that pressed against his brother's consciousness, whispers that spoke of power through submission, strength through worship, salvation through surrender. "Show me," Angron said, placing a hand on Lorgar's shoulder and immediately regretting the contact. Through their physical connection, the full scope of his brother's spiritual anguish crashed over him like a tide of molten metal. Lorgar's faith had become a wound that refused to heal, a need for transcendence that no mortal philosophy could satisfy. The Emperor's imperial truth, with its emphasis on reason and rejection of superstition, left a void in Lorgar's heart that other powers had begun to fill. They walked through the streets of Varadesh in silence, past towering cathedrals whose architecture seemed to shift and flow when viewed from the corner of the eye. The city's inhabitants prostrated themselves as the two Primarchs passed, their devotion so intense that it registered as physical heat against Angron's empathic senses. What yet beneath their worship lay something else, a fear that spoke of consequences for those who failed to show proper reverence, and darker still, a longing for something that no human authority could provide. The source of the corruption became clear when they entered the Cathedral of the Infinite Word, the massive structure that dominated the city's heart. Here, surrounded by stained glass windows that depicted scenes of cosmic grandeur, stood Cor-Ferran and Erebus, the two men who had shaped Lorgar's spiritual development since childhood. Both bowed respectfully as the Primarchs approached, yet Angron's empathic abilities revealed the true nature of what lay beneath their humble facades. Cor-Ferran's mind was a fortress of calculated ambition wrapped in genuine paternal affection. He loved Lorgar as a father loves a son, but that love had been corrupted by a hunger for power that made him willing to sacrifice his foster child's soul for the promise of cosmic authority. More dangerous still was Erebus, whose consciousness blazed with a charisma so intense it was almost blinding, yet at its core lay a void of such absolute emptiness that it seemed to devour light itself. "My Lord Angron," Erebus said, his voice carrying the sort of warmth that made listeners want to trust him completely. "Word of your miraculous healing has reached even our distant world. Surely such a restoration is a sign that the powers that govern the universe smile upon those who serve faithfully." The words were carefully chosen, designed to plant seeds of specific ideas, while seeming to offer only congratulations. Through his empathic perception, Angron could see the subtle web of influence that Erebus wove with every sentence. Suggestions that healing implied divine favor, that favor required service, that service demanded submission to powers greater than the self. "The only power that governs my universe is the will to heal, rather than harm," Angron replied, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed to make the cathedral's shadows recoil. "I was restored, not as a reward for service, but as a gift freely given by those who loved me enough to risk everything for my salvation." The statement struck Erebus like a physical blow. Though he hid his reaction, behind a mask of thoughtful consideration. Through his empathic abilities, Angron felt the dark apostle's mind racing as he sought new angles of approach, new ways to plant the seeds of corruption in soil that had proven unexpectedly resistant. Cor Farron stepped forward, his weathered features set with the sort of paternal concern that had shaped Lorgar's childhood. "Yet surely you must acknowledge that such gifts come from somewhere, Lord Angron. Your father, the Emperor, possesses great power. But is he truly the highest authority in the cosmos? Are there not forces older and greater that even he must acknowledge?" The question was a trap wrapped in philosophical inquiry, designed to open doorways in the mind that could later be exploited. Yet before Angron could respond, he felt Lorgar's consciousness reaching out to his through their fraternal bond. What his brother showed him made the Primarch's blood run cold with recognition and rage. Through Lorgar's memories, Angron witnessed decades of careful manipulation and spiritual grooming. Cor Farron and Erebus had worked patiently to cultivate his brother's natural spirituality, feeding his hunger for transcendence, while gradually steering him away from healthy expressions of faith and toward something far more dangerous. They had taught him to see worship not as a personal choice, but as a cosmic necessity, to view submission not as weakness, but as strength, to believe that true power could only be achieved by surrendering the self to authorities beyond mortal understanding. The revelation filled Angron with a fury that was entirely his own, unmarked by the artificial chemicals that had once driven his rage. Or these men had taken his brother's greatest strength, his capacity for faith and hope, and were slowly transforming it into the instrument of his destruction. Yet even as the anger burned through him, Angron's empathic abilities showed him something that tempered his wrath with understanding. Lorgar was not a victim of corruption so much as a willing participant in his own seduction. His hunger for meaning was so profound that he would rather embrace a lie that offered purpose than accept a truth that left him spiritually empty. The Emperor's imperial truth, for all its rational strength, could not fill the void in Lorgar's heart that had been carved there by his very nature as a being created to inspire and uplift others. "Brother," Angron said, now turning to face Lorgar directly while ignoring the two men who had orchestrated this spiritual poison. "Walk with me. There are things that must be said between us alone." They left the cathedral and climbed to the highest spire of the city, where the twin sons of Colchis painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Here, far above the whispers and influences that plagued the streets below, Angron opened his empathic abilities fully and reached out to touch the deepest parts of his brother's consciousness. What he found there broke his heart. Lorgar's soul was like a garden that had been planted with beautiful flowers and poisonous weeds in equal measure, the two so intertwined that removing the corruption might destroy the beauty that remained. His brother's faith was genuine and powerful, but it had been shaped by decades of subtle manipulation into forms that served purposes far removed from its original purity. "I can feel it," Angron whispered, his voice thick with shared pain, "the emptiness that drives you, the hunger that cannot be satisfied by reason alone. But I can also see what they are doing to you, how they are feeding that hunger with promises that will ultimately devour you from within." Lorgar's response was a sob that seemed torn from the depths of his soul. "I need to believe, brother. I need there to be something greater than myself, some purpose that justifies the burden of existence. Father's truth is cold and empty, offering nothing but the endless accumulation of knowledge and power. Yet when I reach for something more, I find only whispers in the darkness, promising things that terrify even as they tempt." Through their empathic connection, Angron began to share his own experiences, not just the restoration of his abilities, but the deeper understanding that had come with it. He showed Lorgar the true nature of love and sacrifice, the way that genuine care for others could provide meaning without requiring submission to cosmic powers. He revealed the strength that came from choosing to bear another's pain willingly, the purpose that could be found in healing rather than worship. Faith need not require the surrender of the self, Angron said, his words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. It can be found in the choice to care for others despite the cost, in the decision to create rather than destroy, out in the will to heal, even when it means taking on the pain of those we seek to help. As he spoke, Angron began to absorb some of the spiritual anguish that tormented his brother, drawing Lorgar's pain into his own consciousness, where his restored empathy could process and transform it. The process was excruciating, like trying to digest poison, but it provided his brother with the first relief from spiritual torment that he had experienced in years. The effect on Lorgar was immediate and profound. As the crushing weight of existential despair lifted from his shoulders, he began to see the influences that had shaped his thinking with new clarity. The whispers that had seemed like divine guidance revealed themselves as something far more sinister, and the promises of transcendence through submission showed their true face as offers of spiritual slavery. "They were using me," Lorgar whispered, his voice filled with the sort of betrayed understanding that came from seeing a beloved mentor's true nature. Corphiron and Erebus. They were guiding me toward something that would have destroyed everything I truly value. Angron nodded, feeling his brother's consciousness stabilizing as the corrupting influences lost their hold. Yet he knew that the danger was far from over. Corphiron and Erebus would not surrender their prize easily, and the powers that whispered from beyond the veil would seek new ways to reclaim what they had lost. "We must cleanse your legion," Angron said, his voice carrying the sort of gentle authority that came from genuine compassion rather than the desire for dominance. Not through violence or punishment, but through understanding and healing. Your warriors follow you out of love and loyalty, not corruption. If we can show them a better path, they will choose it willingly. Together, the two Primarchs returned to the cathedral, where Corphiron and Erebus waited with barely concealed concern. Through his empathic abilities, Angron could feel their growing alarm as they sensed the change in Lorgar's spiritual state. The hooks of influence they had planted so carefully over the years were beginning to loosen their hold. "We require a new direction for the word-bearers," Lorgar announced, his voice carrying a clarity that had been absent for years. "The path of worship and submission has led us toward darkness, disguised as light. From this day forward, we will seek transcendence, not through surrender to cosmic powers, but through service to the ideals that make humanity worth preserving." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Erebus attempted to reassert his influence through subtle psychological manipulation, while Corphiron appealed to paternal authority and decades of shared history. Yet their words fell on ears that had been cleansed of their poison, and their techniques were laid bare before Angron's empathic perception. When it became clear that their spiritual hold over Lorgar had been broken, both men revealed their true nature. Erebus's mask of charismatic wisdom slipped to reveal the void of cosmic ambition beneath, while Corphiron's paternal love curdled into possessive rage. They had invested too much in Lorgar's corruption to surrender their prize without a fight. The battle that followed was fought not with weapons, but with words and wills, a contest between the powers of corruption and redemption that would determine not just Lorgar's fate, but the future direction of an entire legion. Angron stood beside his brother, his empathic abilities serving as both shield and sword, as he helped Lorgar resist the final, desperate attempts to reclaim his soul. In the end, it was love that proved stronger than manipulation, compassion that triumphed over corruption, and the bonds of brotherhood that held firm against forces that sought to tear them apart. Corphiron and Erebus were stripped of their authority and exiled from Colchis, or their decades of careful work undone by the simple power of one brother helping another see clearly. As the twin suns set over the purged city, Lorgar knelt in the empty cathedral and wept tears of both grief and joy. The faith that had defined him for so long was dead. But in its place grew something new, a dedication to the ideals of healing and hope that his brother had shown him, a purpose that required no submission to cosmic powers beyond the love that bound one soul to another. "I understand now," Lorgar whispered, his voice echoing through the empty space. "The true divine lies not in powers beyond our reach, but in the choices we make to lift each other up rather than tear each other down." Angron placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, feeling the peace that had finally come to Lorgar's tormented spirit. But one more soul had been saved from the darkness, one more brother restored to the light. Yet even as he celebrated this victory, Angron's empathic abilities detected the shadows that still moved at the edges of the galaxy, the whispers that sought new voices to carry their poison. The war for the souls of humanity was far from over. But today, at least, love had proven stronger than hate, and hope had triumphed over despair. The War Council aboard the flagship Vengeful Spirit had been called to address the strategic implications of the Colchis incident, but the true purpose became clear the moment Horus entered the chamber. The War Master's presence filled the room like a storm front, his charisma as overwhelming as ever. Yet beneath the perfect facade lay currents of tension that made the very air seem to crackle with unspoken threat. Through his empathic abilities, Angron felt the careful calculation behind his brother's every gesture, the way Horus had orchestrated this gathering to serve purposes far removed from military strategy. The assembled primarchs stood around the great holotable, their faces reflecting various degrees of concern and confusion. Gilliman's tactical mind struggled to understand why a single legion's internal reformation required such high-level attention. Vulcan radiated his usual warmth, though even his optimistic nature seemed subdued by the tension that pervaded the chamber. Magnus watched with the sort of intense curiosity that marked his approach to all mysteries, while Perturabo maintained his characteristic, stoic distance from what he clearly viewed as another example of favoritism and wasted effort. "Brothers," Horus began, his voice carrying the sort of authority that had made him the Emperor's chosen heir. "We gather today to address a concerning trend that threatens the very foundation of our great crusade. The recent modifications to established doctrine require careful consideration before they spread further through our ranks." The words were carefully neutral, but Angron's enhanced senses detected the venom that lay beneath their surface. Horus spoke of modifications and doctrine, but his emotional resonance betrayed the truth. He saw Angron's healing and its consequences as a direct threat to plans that had been years in the making. The War Master had invested much in cultivating specific relationships with his brothers, fostering particular resentments and dependencies that would serve his purposes when the time came for action. "I fail to see the concern," Vulcan said, his voice carrying the sort of genuine puzzlement that marked all his interactions with political maneuvering. Angron's healing has restored him to his true nature, while his intervention on Colchis has saved another brother from a path that led only to destruction. These seem like unqualified victories for the Imperium. Horus's smile never wavered, but Angron felt the spike of irritation that Vulcan's words provoked. "And yet," the War Master replied smoothly, "we must consider the broader implications of such emotional interventions. Our legions are instruments of conquest, shaped by decades of warfare and discipline. When we begin to prioritize feelings over function, we risk undermining the very mechanisms that have brought us victory after victory." The statement was a masterpiece of subtle manipulation designed to plant seeds of doubt while appearing to address legitimate tactical concerns. Through his empathic perception, Angron could see how Horus had crafted his words to resonate with each brother's particular insecurities. Gilliman's love of efficiency was appealed to through suggestions that emotion compromised function. Perturabo's sense of being undervalued was fed by implications that some Primarchs received special consideration. Even Magnus was targeted, with subtle suggestions that empirical analysis was being abandoned in favor of sentiment. "You speak of feelings and function as if they were natural enemies," Angron said, his voice carrying a calmness that seemed to surprise even himself. "Yet my experience suggests the opposite. A warrior who fights for love is stronger than one who fights from hate. A leader who understands his followers' hearts commands more true loyalty than one who rules through fear alone." The response clearly frustrated Horus, though he hid his reaction behind a mask of reasonable concern. And what of discipline? What of the hard choices that leadership demands? Not every decision can be weighed against its emotional cost. Sometimes we must sacrifice the few to save the many, even when it tears at our hearts to do so. Through their empathic connection, Angron felt the web of half-truths and carefully crafted justifications that surrounded his brother's words. Horus spoke of hard choices and necessary sacrifices, but beneath the noble rhetoric lay a deeper truth. He had already begun to see his fellow Primarchs not as brothers to be protected, but as resources to be expended in service of a vision that placed himself at the center of all things. "You speak truly," Angron replied, his tone remaining steady despite the growing darkness he sensed in his brother's soul. "Leadership does require hard choices. The question is whether we make those choices from wisdom or from fear, from love or from hunger for power that has been disguised as duty." The words struck home with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Horus's composure cracked for just an instant, revealing a flash of the anger and resentment that had been carefully hidden beneath his perfect facade. In that moment, Angron's empathic abilities penetrated the barriers that the War Master had constructed around his consciousness, and what he found there made his blood run cold. Horus's mind was a battlefield where two natures warred for supremacy. The brother Angron remembered, charismatic, noble, genuinely dedicated to their father's vision, still existed. But he was being slowly consumed by something that whispered of power without limit, glory without end, and the righteous fury of those who had been betrayed by those they trusted most. The corruption was subtle but profound, eating away at Horus's capacity for doubt and self-reflection, while amplifying his natural pride and ambition into something that bordered on megalomania. "I can see it," Angron said quietly, his words meant for Horus alone, but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "The darkness that grows within you, brother. The whispers that tell you that Father's love is conditional, that your victories are unappreciated, that you deserve better than the burden of serving another's dream." The effect of these words was immediate and explosive. Horus's carefully maintained composure shattered completely, revealing the full extent of the rage and resentment that had been building within him for years. When he spoke again, his voice carried a venom that shocked the assembled Primarchs with its intensity. "You dare to lecture me about darkness?" Horus snarled, his perfect features twisting with an anger that seemed almost inhuman in its purity. "You, who spent decades as a slave to artificial rage, who required our father's direct intervention to become something approaching functional. What could you possibly understand about the burdens of true leadership?" The attack was both personal and calculated, designed to wound while simultaneously discrediting anything Angron might say in response. Yet instead of anger, the healed Primarch felt only sadness for what his brother was becoming. Through his empathic abilities, he could sense the pain that drove Horus's corruption, the bone-deep loneliness of command, the weight of expectations that could never be fully met, the fear that despite all his achievements, he was loved not for himself, but for what he could provide to others. "I understand more than you know," Angron replied, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to surprise even Horus. "I understand what it feels like to be broken by forces beyond your control, to have your nature twisted by those who claim to know better, to wonder whether those who say they love you would still do so if they knew the darkness you carry. The words penetrated deeper than any weapon could have reached, touching the wounded core of Horus's identity with surgical precision. For a moment, the War Master's mask fell away completely, revealing a being so consumed by doubt and pain that even his corruption seemed like a form of mercy. In that instant, Angron felt a connection form between them, not the false bond of shared corruption, but the genuine empathy of one wounded soul recognizing another. Yet the moment of vulnerability passed as quickly as it had come. Horus's pride reasserted itself, wrapping around his wounded spirit like armor, forged from denial and righteous anger. The whispers that had been feeding his corruption for years seized upon this moment of exposed weakness, transforming his pain into fuel for a fury that burned brighter than any star. "Enough," Horus said, his voice now carrying an authority that seemed to press against the consciousness of everyone in the chamber. "You speak of understanding, but you understand nothing. You see darkness where there is only the courage to face hard truths. You mistake strength for corruption because you have forgotten what it means to be willing to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than yourself." As he spoke, Horus began to weave something that was not quite psychic power, but was far more dangerous, a web of conviction so intense that it took on almost physical properties, pressing against the minds of those around him with visions of imperial tyranny, endless war, and the crushing weight of serving a vision that demanded everything while offering nothing in return. The other Primarchs stepped back instinctively, their own psychological defenses struggling against the onslaught of perfectly crafted despair. Angron alone stood firm, his empathic abilities allowing him to see through the visions to the pain that powered them. Every image of imperial brutality that Horus projected was rooted in real events, real choices that had caused real suffering. Yet beneath the legitimate grievances lay a corruption that twisted justified anger into something that served purposes far removed from justice or mercy. "I see what you're doing," Angron said, his voice cutting through the psychic pressure like a blade of pure clarity. "You take real pain and real injustice and use them to justify choices that will create more of both. You speak of sacrifice, but what you really offer is the surrender of conscience in exchange for the illusion of power." The confrontation that followed was fought not with weapons, but with will and wisdom. Two Primarchs locked in a battle that would determine not just their own fates, but the future direction of the entire Great Crusade. Horus pressed his attack with visions of futility and betrayal, showing Angron glimpses of a future where the Emperor's dream collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Yet for every image of despair, Angron countered with memories of love and sacrifice, at moments when the bonds between brothers had proven stronger than the forces that sought to tear them apart. The struggle might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by something that neither combatant had anticipated. From somewhere within the fortress of corruption that Horus had built around his consciousness came a voice that both Primarchs recognized. The true Horus, the brother they had known before the whispers began, crying out in anguish at what he was becoming. "Help me," the voice whispered, so faint that only Angron's empathic abilities could detect it. "I don't want this. I don't want to become what they're making me. But I can't stop. The whispers are too strong, the anger too perfect, the justifications too complete." The revelation changed everything. In an instant, Angron understood that his brother was not a willing collaborator in his own corruption, but a victim of forces that had systematically dismantled his psychological defenses over a period of years. The Horus who had been attacking him was real, but he was also a construction built from legitimate grievances and artificial amplification, a prison built around the true War Master's soul. Yet even as understanding dawned, the moment of opportunity passed. The corrupted aspects of Horus's consciousness reasserted control, burying the plea for help beneath layers of renewed anger and righteous conviction. When he spoke again, his voice carried no trace of vulnerability, only the cold certainty of someone who had made peace with their own damnation. "You offer healing to a wound that cannot be healed," Horus said, his words carrying a finality that seemed to close off all possibility of redemption. "Some prices are too high to pay, some sacrifices too great to make. I have chosen my path, brother, and I will walk it to its end." The War Council dissolved in the aftermath of the confrontation, the assembled Primarchs dispersing to their own commands with a weight of knowledge that none of them had wanted to bear. The unity that had sustained them through decades of conquest had been shattered by the revelation that one of their own had already begun the journey toward something that could only end in tragedy. As Angron prepared to depart the vengeful spirit, he felt a hand fall upon his shoulder. Turning, he found himself facing Horus once more, though this time the War Master's expression carried none of the anger that had defined their earlier confrontation. Instead, there was only a sadness so profound that it seemed to age his perfect features by centuries. "I want you to know," Horus said, quietly, his words meant for Angron alone, "that what happens next is not about hate. It's not even about disagreement with Father's vision. It's about the fact that some chains are forged too perfectly to ever be broken, and some prices are too high to pay even for redemption." Before Angron could respond, Horus was gone, leaving only the echo of his words and the crushing weight of lost possibility. Through his empathic abilities, Angron felt the true scope of what had been revealed. The corruption that had claimed his brother was not simple ambition or pride, but a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare that had been waged against the War Master's soul for years. By the time Horus had recognized what was happening to him, it had been too late to resist. The galaxy stood on the edge of a precipice, balanced between salvation and catastrophe. Angron's healing had given them a weapon against corruption, but it had also forced their enemies to reveal themselves before all the pieces were in place. The war that was coming would test not just their strength and tactics, but their ability to hold on to love and hope in the face of forces that sought to turn brother against brother. Yet as Angron walked through the corridors of the vengeful spirit, he carried with him one crucial piece of knowledge. Somewhere within the fortress of corruption that surrounded Horus's consciousness, or the true War Master still lived. He was trapped, overwhelmed, perhaps beyond any conventional rescue, but he was still there, and as long as that spark of the true Horus remained, there might yet be hope for a redemption that seemed impossible. The Red Angel had been saved from his chains. The question now was whether love could prove strong enough to save a brother who had been convinced that his chains were wings. The descent into the deepest levels of terror was a journey through layers of history that predated human civilization. Ancient stone gave way to archaeotech corridors, then to passages carved from materials that had no names in any mortal tongue. With each step deeper into the palace's heart, Angron felt the weight of ages pressing down upon him, as if he walked through the accumulated dreams and nightmares of an entire species. At his side, the Emperor moved with the careful precision of someone bearing a burden too vast for any single consciousness to carry alone. What you witnessed aboard Horus's flagship was not an isolated incident, the Emperor said, his voice echoing through corridors lit by phosphorescent panels that seemed to pulse with their own life. The corruption that has claimed your brother is part of a larger pattern, a systematic campaign that has been waged against humanity's future for longer than you might imagine. The time has come to show you why I created the Primarchs, and what role you were always meant to play in the war that is coming. They passed through security checkpoints, manned by custodians, whose auramite armor blazed with protective wards so powerful they were visible to naked sight. Each guardian bowed as the Emperor approached, their reverence carrying none of the mechanical obedience of lesser servants, but rather the deep respect of those who understood the magnitude of what their lord protected. Through his empathic abilities, Angron felt their emotions. Dedication so pure it bordered on the mystical, purpose so absolute that death seemed preferable to failure. The golden throne chamber opened before them, like a revelation made manifest in adamantium and psychically reactive crystal. The massive device dominated the space with its impossible geometries, was its golden surfaces inscribed with equations that described the fundamental forces of reality itself. Yet for all its majesty, the throne was clearly incomplete, a work in progress that awaited the final components that would transform it from potential into actuality. Around its base, tech adepts worked in reverent silence, their augmented minds struggling to comprehend principles that stretched the boundaries of human understanding. "Behold the keystone of humanity's future," the Emperor said, gesturing toward the throne with something approaching pride. "Not a seat of earthly power, but a gateway to transcendence itself. Through this device, humanity will break free from the limitations that have bound it to a single world, a single system, a single dimension of existence." Angron approached the throne with the sort of careful respect that its presence seemed to demand, his empathic senses recoiling from the psychic pressure that radiated from its crystal matrices. Yet beneath the overwhelming power, he detected something that surprised him: fragility. The device was like a musical instrument, tuned to frequencies that could shatter reality itself, requiring perfect harmony between its components to function without destroying everything around it. "I sense instability," Angron said, his restored abilities picking up the subtle fluctuations that threatened the throne's delicate equilibrium. "The psychic resonance is fluctuating beyond safe parameters. What you've built here requires a level of control that no single mind could maintain." The Emperor's smile was sad but genuine, the expression of someone who had finally found another soul capable of understanding the true scope of his burden. Indeed, the Webway project was never intended to be operated by one consciousness alone. It requires multiple psychic anchors, each one capable of bearing a portion of the dimensional stress while maintaining perfect synchronization with the others. As he spoke, the Emperor gestured toward hidden alcoves around the throne chamber, where additional seats waited in dormant readiness. Each one was smaller than the main throne, but no less complex, their surfaces inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and flow when viewed directly. What the purpose was clear. The Golden Throne was designed to be operated by a network of linked consciousness, a council of psychic beings working in perfect harmony. "The Primarchs," Angron whispered, understanding dawning like sunrise after an endless night. "We were never meant to be generals or conquerors. We were created to power this device, to serve as the psychic infrastructure for humanity's next evolutionary step." The Emperor nodded, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of sorrow and determination that spoke of decisions made in desperate times. "You were created to be humanity's guides into a future free from the predations of chaos, where the warp storms that have isolated our worlds for millennia would become pathways to unlimited expansion. Through the Webway, mankind could spread to every corner of the galaxy without feeding the dark powers that lurk between the stars. The revelation carried implications that staggered even Angron's enhanced consciousness. Every campaign of the Great Crusade, every brother found and brought into the fold, every victory that had extended imperial control across the galaxy, all of it had been preparation for this moment. The Primarchs had been created not as independent commanders, but as components in a machine of transcendence, each one designed to play a specific role in humanity's salvation. Yet even as understanding flooded through him, Angron felt the weight of what had gone wrong. Through his empathic abilities, he could sense the psychic distortions that plagued the throne's operation, the fluctuations that spoke of interference from sources that should not have been able to reach across the dimensional barriers. The Webway project was under attack, not from external enemies, but from the very forces it was designed to circumvent. "The corruption has spread farther than we feared," the Emperor continued, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to age his immortal features. "The powers that seek to claim my sons have also learned of the webway's existence. They pour their influence through dimensional fractures, seeking to destabilize the very foundations upon which humanity's future rests." As if summoned by his words, alarms began to sound throughout the chamber as the throne's stability fluctuated beyond acceptable parameters. Tech adepts rushed to their stations while custodians took defensive positions, out their training adapting to threats that no military doctrine had ever anticipated. Through the throne's psychic emanations, something vast and malevolent pressed against the barriers between dimensions, seeking entry into the heart of human civilization. The Emperor moved to the throne without hesitation, his consciousness expanding to interface with the device's complex systems. Yet even his vast psychic power was insufficient to stabilize the cascading failures that threatened to tear holes in reality itself. The burden was too great for any single mind to bear, no matter how enhanced or ancient. "I need an anchor," the Emperor said through gritted teeth as dimensional stress began to take its toll on his physical form. "Someone whose psychic signature can complement my own, who can bear part of the burden while maintaining perfect synchronization." Angron stepped forward without hesitation, his restored empathic abilities allowing him to sense exactly what was required. The Emperor needed not just power, but understanding, not just strength, but the sort of emotional resonance that could maintain stability in the face of forces that sought to turn order into chaos. His own gift for absorbing and transforming pain made him uniquely suited to serve as a psychic buffer, taking on the dimensional stress while leaving his father free to maintain the delicate balance that kept the webway intact. The connection formed with an intimacy that surpassed anything Angron had experienced before. Through the throne's crystal matrices, his consciousness merged with the Emperor's, whilst creating a gestalt entity that was more than the sum of its parts. Together, they reached out across dimensions that existed beyond the physical universe, touching the edges of the webway itself. What they found there took Angron's breath away. The webway was not simply a network of tunnels through space, but a realm of pure potential, where thought became reality and will shaped the fundamental forces of existence. Here, free from the predatory influences of the warp, humanity could build a civilization that transcended the limitations of physical law. Cities could exist as pure concept, fleets could travel at the speed of thought, and the dreams of an entire species could become manifest reality. Yet the vision was marred by intrusions that spoke of corruption and decay. Through fractures in the webway's structure, the entities that existed as pure malevolence poured their influence into what should have been a realm of infinite possibility. The damage was extensive, but not irreparable. If the right combination of consciousness could be assembled to serve as anchors, the network could be stabilized and the intrusions sealed. "Do you see it?" the Emperor asked, his mental voice carrying across dimensions to reach Angron's consciousness. "The future that waits for humanity if we can complete what we began. Not just survival, but transcendence. Not just expansion, but evolution into something that chaos cannot touch or corrupt." Through their shared connection, Angron experienced visions of what the galaxy might become under human guidance. Worlds where war was a distant memory, where the hunger and want that drove so much conflict had been eliminated through technologies that could reshape reality itself. Children who grew up free from the fear of alien predation or demonic corruption, their minds expanding to encompass possibilities that no previous generation had dared to imagine. Yet he also saw the price of failure. If the Webway project collapsed, humanity would remain trapped in a cycle of expansion and corruption, each new world claimed from the darkness serving only to feed the very powers that sought its destruction. The Great Crusade would become an endless war against enemies that grew stronger with each victory, until eventually the imperium would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. "I understand now," Angron said, his consciousness reaching out to help stabilize the fluctuating dimensional matrix. "The healing I received was not just personal restoration, but preparation for this role. My empathic abilities allow me to absorb the psychological stress of maintaining the webway while leaving you free to handle the technical aspects." Together, they began the delicate work of repairing the damage that had been done to the network's structure. It was exhausting work that required perfect coordination between their consciousness, each one handling aspects of the task that the other could not manage alone. The Emperor's vast knowledge and psychic power provided the framework, while Angron's empathic gifts served as a buffer against the emotional and spiritual toxins that leaked through from the warp. Hours passed like minutes as they worked, their combined consciousness operating on levels that transcended normal human experience. Gradually, the fluctuations that had threatened the throne's stability began to subside, replaced by the sort of harmonious resonance that spoke of systems operating at peak efficiency. The dimensional intrusions were sealed one by one, their malevolent influence banished back to the realm where such things belonged. When the immediate crisis had passed and the throne's operation had been stabilized, the two beings slowly separated their consciousness, returning to the limitations of individual identity. Yet the connection they had formed left both changed. Their understanding of each other and of the work ahead deepened beyond anything that words could convey. "This is what I intended for all my sons," the Emperor said, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and regret. Each Primarch was designed to fulfill a specific role in operating the webway network. Horus was meant to serve as the strategic coordinator, his charisma binding the others together in common purpose. Magnus would have provided the deep theoretical understanding necessary to explore the network's full potential. Guilliman's organizational genius would have maintained the practical aspects of administration. The list continued as the Emperor described the intended role of each Primarch in the grand design, their unique gifts combining to create a system of governance that could guide humanity through its transformation into something beyond mortal limitation. Yet as he spoke, the weight of what had been lost became clear. The corruption had claimed too many of his sons before they could fulfill their intended purpose, and the window for completing the original plan was rapidly closing. "But perhaps there is another way," the Emperor continued, his ancient gaze fixing on Angron with something that might have been hope. "Your gift for healing psychological wounds makes you uniquely suited for a different role, not just as an operator of the throne, but as the one who might yet save your brothers from the corruption that claims them." The proposal that followed was both simple and terrifyingly complex. With Angron's empathic abilities enhanced by his connection to the throne's psychic matrix, he would be able to reach out across the galaxy to touch the consciousness of his corrupted brothers. The process would be dangerous, requiring him to expose himself to the very influences that had claimed them, but it offered the possibility of redemption where none had existed before. "I will need time to prepare," Angron said, feeling the weight of decision settling upon his shoulders like armor forged from hope and tempered by necessity. "And I will need anchors to keep me grounded when I venture into the darkness that has claimed them. But yes, Father, I will attempt what must be attempted." The Emperor's smile carried warmth that Angron had rarely seen, the expression of a parent who had found reason to hope when all seemed lost. "Then let us begin this work in earnest. The galaxy stands at a crossroads, and the choices we make in the coming days will determine whether humanity rises to transcendence or falls to forces that seek its eternal enslavement." As they prepared to leave the throne chamber, Angron felt the full weight of his transformation settling into final form. He was no longer just a healed warrior or even a Primarch seeking to guide his legion toward a better path. He had become something new, a bridge between the Emperor's vast vision and the human hearts that must embrace it, a healer who might yet save not just his brothers, but the entire future of their species. The war for humanity's soul was entering its final phase, and for the first time since his restoration, Angron dared to hope that love might yet prove stronger than corruption, that healing might triumph over hate, and that the bonds of brotherhood might yet overcome the whispers that sought to tear them apart. The first sign of the assault came not as an alarm or a warning, but as a silence so profound it seemed to drain meaning from the universe itself. Across Terra, astropaths collapsed as their minds were suddenly severed from the warp, their psychic screams cutting off mid-transmission as something vast and terrible moved through the imperium toward the heart of human civilization. In the throne chamber, the Emperor's eyes snapped open with an intensity that made the air itself crackle with unleashed power. "He comes," the Emperor whispered, his words carrying across dimensions to reach every defender on Terra. Khorne himself stirs from his brass throne, no longer content to work through servants and whispers. The blood god seeks to reclaim what he considers his by right of conquest. The assault began with tears in reality itself, crimson wounds in the fabric of space that bled demons into the material realm. Yet this was not the chaotic incursion that might have been expected from the Lord of mindless slaughter. Instead, the attack showed a terrible intelligence, a strategic precision that spoke of rage refined into something approaching art. Every rift opened at a carefully chosen location designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the defender's ability to coordinate their response. From the highest spires of the Imperial Palace to the deepest foundations that touched Terra's molten core, the servants of Khorne poured forth with a unity of purpose that defied their chaotic nature. To bloodletters wielding hell-forged weapons advanced in perfect formation, their brass armor gleaming with reflections of battles that had raged since the birth of stars. Behind them came the greater demons, beings so suffused with their patron's fury that reality itself recoiled from their presence. Angron felt the assault like a physical blow, his enhanced empathic abilities recoiling from the tsunami of rage and hatred that crashed over Terra's psychic defenses. Yet beneath the overwhelming malevolence, he detected something that gave him pause, a thread of desperate need that spoke not of confident conquest, but of a god faced with the prospect of irreversible loss. Khorne was not attacking from strength, but from fear, driven to increasingly desperate measures by the knowledge that his most valued champion had slipped forever beyond his reach. "He seeks to break you through the destruction of everything you have come to value," the Emperor said, his consciousness joining with Angron's through the throne's psychic matrix. "Your gladiator family, your reformed legion, the vision of what humanity might become, all of it will be offered up for slaughter if it means returning you to the path of mindless violence." The defense of Terra mobilized with the efficiency that marked all Imperial operations, yet this battle would not be won through conventional tactics. As custodians and space marines took their positions along the palace's outer walls, Angron found himself facing a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the future direction of the entire galaxy. He could remain safe in the throne chamber, adding his power to the Emperor's efforts to maintain Terra's psychic defenses. Or he could venture forth to meet Khorne's challenge directly, risking everything on the belief that love might prove stronger than hate. "I have to go to him," Angron said, his words carrying a certainty that surprised even himself. This assault is not really about Terra or the Imperium. It's about the fundamental question of whether healing is possible for those who have fallen so far into darkness that they can no longer remember what light looks like. If I remain hidden while others fight my battles, then Khorne has already won the only victory that truly matters. The Emperor's response was not the protest that Angron had expected, but a nod of understanding that spoke of painful wisdom earned through millennia of impossible choices. "Then go, my son. Face the darkness that once claimed you, and show the galaxy what redemption truly means. But do not go alone. Take with you those whose love has sustained you through your darkest hours." The gladiator survivors assembled in the palace's great courtyard, their weathered faces reflecting none of the fear that any reasonable person would feel when facing the physical manifestation of a god's wrath. Corna checked her weapons one final time, her scarred hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Galthan stood silent and ready, his massive frame radiating the sort of calm determination that had carried him through 1,000 arena battles. Young Melek gripped his oversized gladius with white knuckles, his youth making him perhaps the bravest of them all. "My lord," Corna said, her voice carrying the same respectful authority it had held in the fighting pits of Nuceria. "We have followed you into rebellion, through healing, and across the stars themselves. If this is to be our final battle, then we could ask for no greater honor than to stand at your side when it is fought." Through his empathic connection with them, Angron felt the complex web of emotions that bound them together. Love that transcended the simple loyalty of warrior to leader, hope that had survived decades of slavery and degradation, and beneath it all, a faith in the possibility of redemption that no amount of suffering had been able to destroy. They were not warriors in any conventional sense, yet their courage burned brighter than any flame that Khorne could kindle. The confrontation came at the center of the Imperial Palace's largest plaza, where space itself had been warped by the blood god's presence into something approaching an arena. The ground beneath their feet had been transformed into red sand that crunched with the sound of broken bones, while the sky above writhed with crimson clouds that pulsed in rhythm with some vast and terrible heartbeat. At the plaza's center, a figure materialized that dwarfed even the greatest of demons. Khorne stood 3 times the height of a primarch, his form wreathed in flames that burned without consuming and shadows that somehow blazed brighter than any light. His brass armor bore the patina of eons spent in endless battle, each dent and scratch a testament to conflicts that had shaped the very foundations of reality. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every act of violence that had ever been committed, every moment of rage that had ever consumed a mortal heart. "Angron of Nuceria," Khorne said, his words echoing across dimensions both physical and metaphysical. "You were mine before you drew your first breath, claimed in the moment when rage first filled your infant heart. The healing you have undergone is an aberration, a cosmic mistake that I have come to correct. Return to my service willingly, and those you love will be granted the honor of dying quickly." The offer was accompanied by visions that crashed over Angron's consciousness like waves of molten metal, glimpses of power beyond mortal comprehension, of glory that would never fade, of an existence where doubt and pain would be burned away in the purity of eternal rage. Yet beneath the seductive promises, Angron's empathic abilities detected the truth that Khorne could not entirely hide. The god of war was terrified of what his former champion had become, desperate to reclaim him before his example inspired others to seek their own redemption. "I was never yours," Angron replied, his voice carrying across the transformed plaza with absolute conviction. "I was stolen from myself by those who served you, broken and rebuilt as an instrument of your will. What you call healing, I call remembering who I was always meant to be. What you name aberration, I name growth." The battle that followed transcended the physical realm entirely, becoming a contest between fundamental principles that shaped the nature of reality itself. Khorne attacked not with weapons, but with concepts made manifest, rage given form, violence distilled to its purest essence, the primal fury that lurked at the heart of every thinking being's darkest impulses. Each assault sought to overwhelm Angron's consciousness with the chemical certainty of anger, to make him forget the complex emotions that marked his restoration. Yet for every wave of fury that crashed against his consciousness, Angron countered with something that Khorne had never learned to understand, the transformative power of love freely given and pain willingly shared. Through his empathic abilities, he reached out not to his gladiator family or his reformed warriors, but to the broken souls that served as Khorne's demons, touching them with the possibility of redemption they had forgotten existed. The effect was immediate and profound. Across the plaza, demons that had known only rage for eons suddenly remembered what they had been before corruption claimed them. Bloodletters lowered their weapons as fragments of mortal compassion stirred in their brass hearts. Greater demons stumbled as the absolute certainty that had sustained them for millennia cracked under the weight of renewed hope. Khorne's howl of fury shook the foundations of the palace as he felt his servants slipping from his control, their absolute dedication wavering as Angron's influence spread like a contagion of mercy through their ranks. The blood god's form began to destabilize as the conceptual foundations of his existence, the certainty that violence was the ultimate truth, that rage was the only honest emotion, came under assault from principles he could not comprehend or counter. "This is impossible," Khorne raged, his voice carrying the sound of 1,000,000 battlefields falling silent. "Rage is eternal. Violence is truth. You cannot heal what was never whole to begin with." It was then that Angron's gladiator family made their final sacrifice, as Khorne's desperation reached a crescendo that threatened to tear holes in reality itself. The survivors of Nuceria's fighting pits stepped forward as one, their mortal forms blazing with a light that had nothing to do with psychic power and everything to do with the purity of their devotion. "For our Lord," Khorne said simply, her words carrying across the plaza like a prayer made manifest. "For the man who chose to share our pain rather than escape it alone." One by one, they opened their hearts to Angron's empathic abilities, offering not just their loyalty, but the very essence of their souls to serve as anchors in the storm of cosmic fury that raged around them. Through their connection, Angron felt their memories flowing into his consciousness. Every moment of kindness he had shown them, every instant when his presence had made their suffering bearable, every time his empathy had transformed their despair into something approaching hope. The combined weight of their love and sacrifice created something that no demon could withstand and no dark god could corrupt, a moment of perfect understanding that transcended the boundaries between individual consciousness. For one shining instant, Angron became more than a primarch or a healer or even a son of the emperor. He became the living embodiment of the principle that connection was stronger than isolation, that growth was possible even for those who had fallen furthest into darkness. The light that blazed forth from this revelation was not the harsh glare of conquest, but the warm radiance of healing made manifest. It touched every demon in the plaza, every corrupted soul that served as an extension of Khorne's will, offering them something they had thought lost forever, the possibility of choosing a different path. Many fled back to the warp rather than face the implications of what they witnessed, but others lingered, their forms slowly beginning to shift as fragments of their original nature reasserted themselves. Khorne himself recoiled, as if struck by a physical blow, his massive form beginning to dissolve as the absolute certainties that sustained his existence came under assault. The blood god was not being destroyed. Such a thing was beyond the power of any mortal being. But he was being diminished, forced to confront the possibility that his understanding of reality might be incomplete. "This changes nothing," Khorne said, his voice now carrying a note of something that might have been uncertainty. "Rage will return, and violence will resurface. The galaxy bleeds, and it will always bleed, no matter what healing you think you have achieved." Angron's response was not a denial, but an acknowledgement that carried within it the seeds of hope. "Perhaps you speak truth. Perhaps rage and violence will always exist in some form. But so will love and sacrifice, and the willingness to bear another's pain. The question is not whether darkness can be banished forever, but whether light can be kindled brightly enough to show others the way home. As the blood god's form faded back into the warp, his presence leaving behind only the memory of brass and flame, the transformed plaza began to return to its natural state. The red sand became grey stone once more. The writhing sky cleared to reveal the familiar blue of Terra's atmosphere, and the overwhelming presence of cosmic malevolence lifted like a fever finally breaking. The battle was over, but its consequences would ripple through the warp for eons to come. Where once Khorne's influence had been absolute and unquestioned, now there existed cracks in his authority, gaps where redemption might take root and flourish. The god of war had been forced to acknowledge that his understanding of reality was incomplete, that there existed forces in the universe which his philosophy could neither explain nor contain. As Angron knelt beside the still forms of his gladiator family, their sacrifice complete, and their souls finally at peace, he felt the full weight of what had been achieved. They had not defeated Khorne through violence or destroyed him through superior force. Instead, they had offered him something far more dangerous, the possibility of change, the chance to become something other than what he had always been. The siege of hearts was over, and for the first time since the galaxy had learned to bleed, love had proven stronger than hate. In the aftermath of Khorne's defeat, Terra gleamed with a light that had nothing to do with its twin suns. The very air seemed cleaner, as if the departure of the blood god had lifted a miasma that few had even noticed was there. Across the imperial palace, those sensitive to the warp reported a profound shift in the psychic atmosphere. Where once there had been an undercurrent of barely contained violence, now there was something that could only be described as hope made manifest in the Imperium itself. The Emperor stood in the highest tower of the palace, his ancient gaze fixed upon the star-scattered void where humanity's future waited to unfold. Beside him, Angron felt the weight of transformation settling into its final form. The gladiator who had been broken on Nuceria was gone, and the rage-mad Primarch, who had been enslaved by neural implants, was dead. In their place stood something the galaxy had never seen before, a healer whose power extended beyond the merely physical into the realm where souls could be mended and corrupted hearts restored to wholeness. "The work begins now," the Emperor said, his voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of absolute conviction. "What you have proven against Khorne must be extended to your brothers, to the legions, to the very foundations of the Imperium itself. The Great Crusade was meant to be humanity's first step toward transcendence. Perhaps it is not too late for it to become exactly that." In the days that followed, the transformation began in earnest. Angron's first task was the completion of his own legion's reformation, a process that had been interrupted by cosmic events, but never abandoned. The warriors who had chosen to remove their butcher's nails underwent procedures that were no longer experimental, but refined, their consciousness carefully guided through the restoration process by techniques that had been perfected through Angron's own healing. Captain Khan was among the first to emerge from the neural reconstruction chambers, his scarred features reflecting a peace that seemed to transform his very nature. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the aggressive edge that the nails had imposed, replaced instead by the sort of thoughtful authority that marked the finest commanders in any legion. "My lord," Khan said, his words carefully chosen to reflect a new understanding of what leadership truly meant. For the brothers who have undergone the removal report, sensations they had forgotten existed. Doubt, yes, but also curiosity. Fear, but also hope. For the first time in decades, we can think as well as fight. The transformation extended beyond individual warriors to encompass the entire culture of the Legion. Where once the World Eaters had been defined by their capacity for violence, now they became something unprecedented in Imperial history. Warriors whose primary mission was protection rather than conquest, healers whose weapons were wielded only when mercy had been proven insufficient. New training doctrines emerged that emphasized precision over brutality, restraint over excess, and above all, the understanding that every life taken in battle was a tragedy, even when it was a necessity. The Reformed Legion practiced combat scenarios where success was measured not by enemy casualties, but by civilian lives preserved, where tactical excellence was defined by the ability to achieve objectives with minimal bloodshed. Yet even as one legion transformed, Angron's enhanced empathic abilities revealed the scope of the corruption that had spread throughout the Imperium. Through careful psychic reconnaissance, he detected the subtle taint that marked other legions where chaos had begun its insidious work. The process was delicate, requiring him to touch the consciousness of distant primarchs without alerting the powers that sought to claim them. Magnus was the first brother he reached out to heal, the Crimson King's powerful psychic nature making him both vulnerable to corruption and receptive to redemption. The process took place across vast distances, Angron's consciousness traveling through the warp to touch Magnus's mind during a moment when his brother's defenses were lowered by meditation and study. What he found there was not the overt corruption that had claimed Horus, but something more subtle and perhaps more dangerous, a pride in knowledge that was slowly being twisted into arrogance, a hunger for understanding that was being fed with forbidden truths. Yet beneath the gathering shadows lay the Magnus that Angron remembered, a brother whose love of learning had always been matched by genuine compassion for those less gifted than himself. The healing was accomplished not through force, but through understanding, Angron's empathy allowing him to show Magnus the true nature of the influences that sought to claim him. Together, they identified the sources of corruption and began the delicate work of purging them from the Crimson King's consciousness. When the process was complete, Magnus emerged with his love of knowledge intact, but tempered by wisdom, his psychic power enhanced rather than diminished by his return to emotional balance. One by one, other brothers underwent similar healing. Perturabo's bitter resentment was transformed into a deeper understanding of sacrifice and service. Mortarion's paranoid isolation gave way to a renewed faith in the bonds of brotherhood. Even Lorgar, already saved from the worst of his corruption, found his restored faith strengthened by the knowledge that redemption was not just possible but actively being pursued across the galaxy. Yet not all could be saved. Horus remained beyond reach, his corruption so advanced and so carefully constructed that even Angron's enhanced abilities could not penetrate the barriers that had been built around his consciousness. The War Master had become increasingly isolated as his fellow Primarchs underwent their transformation, his perfect facade cracking under the pressure of being the only one who still carried the whispers of chaos. "He watches us," Angron reported to the Emperor, after another failed attempt to reach his corrupted brother. "He knows what we are doing, understands the threat that our healing represents to his patrons. Yet he cannot act openly without revealing himself completely. We have trapped him in a prison of his own making." The Emperor nodded, his expression reflecting a sadness that spoke of painful necessities. "Then we must be prepared for the inevitable. While Horus will not remain passive indefinitely. When he finally acts, it will be with the desperation of someone who knows that his time is running out." The new Great Crusade that emerged from these transformations bore little resemblance to the conquest machine it had once been. Where Imperial forces had once swept across worlds with overwhelming force, now they came as liberators in the truest sense, offering genuine freedom from oppression rather than simply replacing one master with another. Angron's empathic network, now extending across multiple legions, served as an early warning system against both external threats and internal corruption. Worlds that might once have been brought to compliance through bombardment and assault were instead approached with careful diplomacy, backed by the sort of moral authority that came from genuine virtue. The threat of force remained, but it was presented as the last resort of those who genuinely regretted its necessity, rather than the preferred tool of conquerors who gloried in destruction. The results exceeded even the Emperor's most optimistic projections. Compliance rates actually increased as worlds recognized the sincerity of the imperial offer, while the rate of subsequent rebellion dropped to nearly zero. More importantly, the quality of the peace that followed conquest was transformed, what with imperial worlds becoming genuine partners in the expansion of human civilization rather than sullen subjects awaiting the first opportunity for revenge. Yet even as success built upon success, Angron never forgot the price that had been paid for these achievements. In quiet moments, he would retreat to a small shrine he had constructed in memory of his gladiator family, their sacrifice commemorated, not in marble or gold, but in the simple tools they had carried, and the worn sand from the arenas where they had found meaning in struggle. They would have been proud, the Emperor said, during one such visit, his presence a comfort rather than an intrusion. To see how their love has transformed not just you, but the entire direction of human civilization. Their sacrifice echoes through every world that is saved, why every life that is preserved, every moment when mercy triumphs over the easier path of violence. As months turned to years and the new paradigm became established reality, Angron found himself facing a future that the gladiator slave of Nuceria could never have imagined. The Webway project continued to advance, its construction guided by multiple Primarchs working in harmony, rather than the desperate efforts of a single overwhelmed consciousness. The network of tunnels through space and time grew steadily, each new connection bringing humanity closer to the transcendent future that awaited beyond the reach of chaos corruption. The galaxy itself seemed to respond to the change in human nature, with warp storms becoming less frequent and astropathic communication growing more reliable. The Xenos species that had once viewed humanity as just another threat began to approach imperial representatives with offers of genuine cooperation rather than desperate pleas for survival. Even the Eldar, ancient and aloof, sent cryptic messages suggesting that they sensed a fundamental shift in the cosmic balance. Yet challenges remained. In the depths of space, Horus gathered those elements of the Imperium that remained loyal to the old ways, building an alliance of those who preferred the certainty of violence to the complexity of compassion. His rebellion, when it came, would not be the galaxy-spanning civil war of the original timeline, but it would still test everything that Angron and his healed brothers had built. Standing once more in the throne chamber, where his transformation had begun, Angron felt the weight of possibility pressing against his consciousness. Through the Webway's partially completed network, he could sense the potential futures that waited to unfold, some bright with promise, others dark with the shadow of failure. The outcome was not predetermined, would never be predetermined, but for the first time since humanity had reached for the stars, hope outweighed despair. "The dream endures," the Emperor said, his words echoing through the chamber with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Not because it is easy, but because there are those willing to sacrifice for it. Not because it is certain, but because it is worth the risk of everything we are and might become." Angron nodded, his enhanced senses reaching out across the galaxy to touch the minds of those who carried the light forward. Reformed space marines who chose protection over conquest, imperial commanders who measured success by lives saved rather than enemies slain, ordinary humans who dared to hope that their children might inherit a universe where compassion was stronger than hate. The work was far from over. Perhaps it would never be over, requiring eternal vigilance against the forces that sought to drag humanity back into the familiar patterns of violence and corruption. Yet for the first time in 10,000 years of grim darkness, there was genuine hope that a different future was possible. In the depths of the warp, the powers of chaos felt their influence waning as more souls chose healing over hatred, growth over stagnation, love over fear. They would not surrender easily, would fight with increasing desperation as their food sources of emotional toxicity grew scarce. Yet they faced an enemy they had never encountered before, not warriors who sought to destroy them, but healers who offered redemption even to the most corrupted servants of darkness. The galaxy turned on its axis, carrying with it the dreams of countless species and the hopes of those who dared to believe that even in the darkest future, light could find a way to shine. And at the heart of it all stood a former gladiator who had learned that the greatest victory was not the defeat of an enemy, but the transformation of an enemy into a friend. The Red Angel was dead. In his place stood something that had no name, but perhaps needed none, a bridge between what humanity had been and what it might yet become, a reminder that even the most broken souls could find their way back to the light if love proved stronger than the forces that sought to tear it apart. Whether the future would remember him as savior, or simply as the first to prove that healing was possible, only time would tell. But in that moment, surrounded by the potential of what could be achieved when brothers stood together rather than apart, Angron dared to believe that the dream of a better galaxy might yet become reality. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, but for the first time in eons, they seemed to shine a little brighter.